Hey guys! Tonight we begin a journey through one of history's strangest medical mysteries. Imagine living in a time when doctors believed your uterus could pack its bags and wander through your body like a restless tourist, searching for the perfect vacation spot. Sound absurd? For nearly 4,000 years, this was not just a theory, it was accepted medical fact. And the treatments? Well, they were even stranger than the diagnosis itself. So before we explore this fascinating story together, I would love it if you could take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. But only if you truly enjoy what we create here. Your genuine support means everything. And I am curious, where are you right now as you listen? Are you tucked into bed in New York? Winding down after a long day in California, or perhaps watching from somewhere across the ocean? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and I love knowing we are on this journey together. Now dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let us step back in time to discover how the ancient world tried to explain female emotions. Our story begins in Egypt around 1900 BC, on the banks of the Nile River. The pyramids had already been standing for centuries, and Egyptian civilization was flourishing with art, architecture, and medicine that would influence the world for millennia. But even with all their remarkable achievements, the ancient Egyptians were utterly baffled by one thing: women's emotions and physical symptoms that seemed to appear without any visible injury or obvious cause. A woman would complain of chest pain. Another would feel suffocated, unable to catch her breath. Some experienced sudden fits of crying or unexplained melancholy. Others felt dizzy, nauseous, or simply exhausted for no apparent reason. And because there was no blood, no broken bones, no external wounds to explain these symptoms, the Egyptian physicians needed an answer. They needed something they could point to and say, "Aha! That is the problem." And so they came up with what seemed to them a perfectly logical explanation. The uterus, that mysterious organ unique to women, must be moving around inside the body, causing trouble wherever it travelled. This idea was first recorded in the Kahun Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents in existence. Think about that for a moment. Someone sat down with papyrus and ink nearly 4,000 years ago and wrote with complete seriousness that the womb was capable of wandering through a woman's body like a curious child exploring a house. The Egyptians did not think the uterus was necessarily evil or cursed. They simply believed it was, well, restless. If it moved up toward the chest, a woman might feel suffocated or experience heart palpitations. If it wandered toward the throat, she might lose her voice or have trouble swallowing. If it drifted to the head, headaches and dizziness would follow. Every symptom, every complaint could be traced back to this travelling organ. It was like trying to track a mischievous house cat. You never quite knew where it would show up next. Now here is where it gets interesting. If the problem was a wandering uterus, then the solution was obvious. Lure it back to where it belonged. The Egyptian physicians developed treatments that sound almost comically simple to our modern ears, but to them, this was cutting-edge medicine. They would place strong-smelling, pleasant substances near a woman's vulva. Think fragrant oils, sweet perfumes, anything that smelled appealing. The idea was that the uterus, attracted by these lovely scents, would move back down to its proper position, drawn like a bee to a flower. But what if the uterus was particularly stubborn? What if it had wandered too far and was not responding to gentle coaxing? Well, then the physicians would resort to the opposite approach. They would have the woman smell or even swallow bitter, foul-smelling substances near her mouth and nose. Imagine the nastiest thing you can think of: rotting herbs, pungent medicines, things that would make your eyes water. The theory was that the uterus, repelled by these horrible odours, would flee back to the lower abdomen to escape them. The uterus was being treated like a nervous animal that could be herded with the right combination of attraction and repulsion. Think about what this meant for women at the time. You are feeling anxious, depressed, or physically unwell. You go to see a physician, hoping for help and understanding. And instead of asking about your life circumstances, your stress levels, or your overall health, he tells you that your internal organs are misbehaving. Your body is literally working against you. Your uterus has decided to take a little trip, and now you must endure treatments that involve smelling terrible things, while someone places perfumes between your legs. It would almost be funny if it were not so frustrating for the millions of women who endured these diagnoses over thousands of years. But the Egyptian belief in the wandering womb did not stay in Egypt. Ideas travel, especially powerful ideas that seem to explain the unexplainable. And so, when Greek scholars began studying Egyptian medicine, they absorbed this concept and ran with it. In fact, they took it even further. Enter Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, around 400 BC. His name is still invoked today. Physicians take the Hippocratic Oath, promising to do no harm. But Hippocrates, for all his contributions to medical knowledge, was absolutely convinced that the wandering womb theory was legitimate. He wrote extensively about hysteria, a word that comes directly from hystera, the Greek word for uterus. In his mind, the connection was clear. If a woman was hysterical, emotional, irrational, or physically unwell, the root cause was her uterus. But Hippocrates added his own twist to the theory. He believed the uterus became restless and wandering specifically because it was not receiving what he called irrigation from male seed. In other words, if a woman was not having regular sexual intercourse and becoming pregnant, her uterus would grow dry, hot, and agitated. It would start moving around the body, searching for moisture and coolness. The Hippocratic physicians theorized that the womb moved toward the center of the body where it was more crowded, pressing against other organs, causing all manner of physical and mental symptoms. The prescribed treatment was, predictably, marriage and regular sexual activity. Virgins, widows, and unmarried women were considered at highest risk because their wombs were, supposedly, the most neglected, and therefore the most likely to wander. Can you imagine being a young, unmarried woman in ancient Greece feeling sad or anxious, perhaps because of the incredibly restrictive society you lived in, the lack of rights and freedoms you endured, only to be told by a doctor that your problem was simply that you needed a husband? The circular logic is almost impressive in its audacity. Then came Plato, one of the greatest philosophers in human history. In his dialogue called Timaeus, written around 360 BC, he described the uterus in terms that sound almost poetic, if not for the underlying absurdity. He wrote that the womb was like a living creature that desired to create children. When it remained barren for too long, it became distressed and agitated. It would then wander throughout the woman's body, blocking passages, obstructing breathing, and causing disease. Plato essentially personified the uterus, giving it emotions, desires, and motivations. It was sad, it was lonely, it wanted to fulfill its purpose. And when it could not, it threw what amounts to a biological temper tantrum. A century later, a physician named Aretaeus of Cappadocia, living in the 2nd century AD, took the metaphor even further. He famously described the uterus as an animal within an animal. Picture that for a moment. Ancient physicians literally believed women carried a second creature inside them, a creature with its own wants and needs, capable of independent movement. Aretaeus wrote detailed descriptions of how the uterus could move upward toward the ribs, causing chest pain and difficulty breathing, or how it could press against the liver and spleen, causing digestive problems. The prescribed treatments followed the same logic as the Egyptian approaches, but with Greek refinement. Foul odours at the nose, sweet scents at the vagina. The physicians would burn terrible-smelling substances, sulphur, burnt hair, charred leather, and hold them under the woman's nose while simultaneously placing fragrant oils and perfumes near her genitals. It must have been quite a scene. A woman lying down, surrounded by physicians waving smoking censers of burnt materials over her face while applying aromatic substances below, all to coax an organ back to its designated location. But here is what makes this story both tragic and fascinating. Not all ancient physicians agreed with this theory. Galen, another towering figure in ancient medicine who lived in the 2nd century AD, was skeptical. He argued that the uterus could not simply float around the body like a balloon. It was attached by ligaments, he correctly observed. It had a fixed position. Galen proposed that symptoms attributed to the wandering womb were actually caused by the retention of fluids or female seed within the uterus, not by the organ's movement. Unfortunately, while his alternative explanation was slightly more anatomically sound, it still blamed women's reproductive organs for their emotional and physical distress. Progress, but only by inches. Cyrenus of Ephesus, another 2nd century physician, was even more direct in his criticism. He wrote, with what almost sounds like exasperation, that the uterus does not issue forth like a wild animal from its lair, delighted by fragrant odours and fleeing bad odours. He recognized the absurdity of the theory, but despite these voices of reason, the wandering womb concept persisted. Why? Because it offered something powerful, a simple explanation for complex symptoms that society was not ready to understand. Think about what was really happening. Women in the ancient world had virtually no rights. In Greece, they could not own property, participate in politics, or make decisions about their own lives. They were confined to domestic spaces, married off as teenagers to men they often did not choose, expected to produce children continuously, and had no recourse if they were unhappy. Is it any wonder that women experienced anxiety, depression, physical stress symptoms, and emotional distress? But acknowledging the social causes would have required changing society. Blaming a wandering uterus, that was much easier. The theory also served another purpose. It reinforced the idea that women were fundamentally different from men, controlled by their reproductive biology in ways that made them less rational, less stable, less suited for public life. If your uterus could simply decide to go wandering whenever it felt like it, how could you be trusted with important decisions? How could you participate in philosophy, politics, or commerce? The medical theory became a convenient justification for social inequality, and yet there is something almost poignant about the wandering womb theory when you step back and look at it with empathy. These ancient physicians were not monsters. Most of them genuinely wanted to help the women who came to them in distress. They were working with extremely limited knowledge of anatomy and physiology. They could not see inside the body except during the rare occasions of injury or death. They did not understand neurology, psychology, hormones, or the complex interactions between mind and body. So they created a theory that made sense with what they could observe. Women had wombs. Men did not. Women experienced certain symptoms. Men typically did not. Therefore, the womb must be the cause. It was wrong, of course, spectacularly, absurdly wrong, but it was also an attempt, however misguided, to take women's symptoms seriously, to acknowledge that something real was happening, even if the explanation was fantastical. in some ways that makes the story both more forgivable and more frustrating. They were so close to recognizing genuine suffering, yet so far from understanding its true causes. The wandering womb theory would persist for centuries, not decades, not generations, but actual centuries. It would migrate from Egypt to Greece to Rome, surviving the fall of empires, adapting to new cultures, and finding new believers in every era. Medieval European physicians would reference it. Renaissance doctors would debate it. It would not truly begin to fade until the 17th century, nearly 3,500 years after it was first written down. That is longer than Christianity has existed, longer than most languages have remained recognizable. It is a testament to how persistent medical mythology can be, especially when that mythology serves to explain and excuse social structures. But the story of how ancient medicine tried to explain female emotions does not end with the wandering womb. That was just the beginning. Because if physicians believed the uterus could physically travel through the body, imagine what other wild theories they would develop about female biology, emotions, and mental states. And those theories, they would get even stranger. As you drift off tonight, let that image settle in your mind. Ancient physicians, utterly convinced they were practicing sophisticated medicine, treating women's real suffering with scented oils and foul-smelling smoke, trying to herd an organ they believed had a mind of its own. It is absurd. It is tragic. And it is absolutely, undeniably human. Our eternal struggle to understand things beyond our knowledge, to create order out of mystery, even if the order we create makes no sense at all. But the wandering womb was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, because these ancient minds had to explain not just physical symptoms, but emotions themselves. Why did women seem more prone to tears, to melancholy, to what seem like unpredictable moods? And if the uterus could wander, what else could go wrong inside the female body? The answers they came up with would involve the moon, the stars, bodily fluids, and theories so elaborate they would make your head spin. And that's exactly where we are heading next, into the world of humours, where being female meant being fundamentally, constitutionally imbalanced in ways that would supposedly explain everything from sadness to anger to simple exhaustion. The ancient physicians were just getting started with their theories, and trust me, they were about to get creative. So the ancient physicians had established that the uterus could wander, but that theory, strange as it was, only explained part of the puzzle. There was still a bigger question looming over medical minds. Why were women's bodies so different from men's in the first place? Why did women seem more emotional, more prone to tears, more susceptible to melancholy? The answer they came up with would dominate Western medicine for over 2,000 years, and it all came down to 4 liquids supposedly sloshing around inside the human body. Welcome to the world of humoral theory, one of the longest-lasting and most influential medical frameworks in history. And fair warning, this is where things get deliciously weird. Because according to the greatest minds of ancient Greece and medieval Europe, women were not just different from men, they were fundamentally, constitutionally, biologically colder and wetter, and that simple classification would be used to explain and excuse nearly every aspect of female emotion and behaviour for millennia. Let me take you back to ancient Greece sometime around 400 BC. Hippocrates and his followers were trying to understand how the human body worked. Remember, they could not run blood tests or take x-rays or even safely perform dissections on living subjects. They had to work with what they could observe from the outside. And what they observed was that people got sick in different ways. Some illnesses involved fever and heat. Others involved chills and cold. Some produced thick, sluggish fluids. Others produce thin, watery ones. From these observations, they developed a theory that would seem perfectly logical for its time. The body must contain different types of fluids, and health depended on keeping those fluids in balance. They identified 4 primary fluids, or humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour was associated with specific qualities. Blood was hot and moist. Phlegm was cold and moist. Yellow bile was hot and dry. Black bile was cold and dry. Stay with me here, because this is about to get relevant to our story. According to humoral theory, everyone had all 4 humours, but the balance varied from person to person. Your unique mixture of humours determined your temperament, your personality, your health, and even your emotional tendencies. Now, here is where gender enters the picture. The ancient physicians, observing the world around them, made what they thought was a logical conclusion. Men and women must have different humoral balances. How did they reach this conclusion? Well, men seemed stronger, more active, more aggressive. They generated body heat through physical labour and exercise. They had visible facial hair, deeper voices, more muscle mass. To the ancient mind, these traits suggested that men were hot and dry, dominated by blood and yellow bile, the warm humours. Women, on the other hand, seemed softer, more passive, more emotional. They menstruated, which the physicians interpreted as the body expelling excess moisture. They had higher-pitched voices, less muscle mass, smoother skin, and crucially, they were not permitted to engage in the same vigorous physical activities as men, which meant they generated less body heat through exercise. Therefore, women must be cold and moist, dominated by phlegm and to some extent blood. Cold and wet, like a damp basement, like a foggy morning. That was the medical establishment's official verdict on female physiology. Can you imagine being told as a medical fact that your entire gender was constitutionally more similar to swamp water than to vibrant fire? But wait, it gets more specific. Because according to Galen, the most influential physician of the Roman Empire who lived in the 2nd century AD, this cold and moist nether had profound implications. Galen taught that women were essentially imperfect or underdeveloped versions of men. He believed, and I'm not making this up, that female genitalia were simply male genitalia that had not fully descended, because the female body lacked sufficient heat to push them outward. Women were literally seen as cooler, damper, less finished versions of the male ideal. This humoral imbalance supposedly explained everything about female nature. Why were women more emotional? Because cold and moist humours made the body sluggish and the mind prone to melancholy. Why did women cry more easily? Because they had excess moisture that needed to escape somewhere, and tears were simply another form of fluid release, like menstruation or other secretions. Why did women seem more changeable, more unpredictable? Because their watery nature made them more easily influenced by external forces, like the moon pulling at the tides. Oh yes, the moon. Medieval physicians, building on ancient Greek foundations, became obsessed with the connection between women and lunar cycles. They noticed that menstruation occurred roughly every month, similar to the moon's cycle of approximately 29.5 days. This could not be a coincidence, they reasoned. Women's wet nature must make them responsive to the moon in the same way that the moon controls the ocean's tides. The moon would literally pull the excess blood out of women's bodies, they believed, the same way it pulled water across the Earth's surface. This idea was repeated in medical texts throughout the medieval period. Physicians wrote seriously about how the moon affected female temperament, female fertility, and female emotions. A woman might be calm and rational during certain phases of the moon, they suggested, but agitated and irrational during others. Her humours would quite literally rise and fall with the lunar cycle, making her moods as predictable and as uncontrollable as the tides themselves. Now, let us talk about what this meant for actual medical treatment. If women were fundamentally too cold and too wet, then the solution to nearly any female complaint was obvious. Warm her up and dry her out. A woman suffering from sadness or anxiety, she needs warming treatments. Struggling with fatigue or lethargy, more heat required. Experiencing what we might today recognize as depression, definitely a cold and moist condition that needs warming. The treatments took many forms, and some of them were surprisingly elaborate. Physicians prescribed what they called heating foods, red meat, wine, spices like cinnamon and pepper, anything that would theoretically add warmth to the body. They recommended vigorous exercise, though of course the kinds of exercise deemed appropriate for women were limited. A gentle walk was acceptable. Actual athletics? Scandalous. They suggested warmer clothing, sitting near fires, taking hot baths. Anything to counteract that supposedly excessive coldness and moisture. But here is where it gets particularly interesting, because one of the most commonly prescribed heating treatments was sexual activity. Remember how Hippocrates believed the uterus wandered when deprived of male seed? Well, humoral theory provided another justification for the same prescription. Sexual intercourse, the physicians taught, was a warming activity. It generated heat through physical exertion. It introduced warm male seed into the cold female body. It caused the woman's humours to circulate more vigorously. Therefore, regular sexual relations with a husband were considered medically therapeutic for women's emotional and physical health. Medieval medical texts spelled this out quite explicitly. A work from the 13th century called The Secrets of Women, and yes, that is its actual title, explained that unmarried women, widows and nuns were at particular risk for humoral imbalances precisely because they lacked this regular warming influence. The text warned that their cold, moist humours would accumulate and stagnate, leading to all manner of physical and emotional problems. The prescription, once again, was marriage. Not because the woman might be lonely, stressed, or dealing with the restrictions of medieval society. No, it was purely a matter of balancing her humours. Think about the circular logic at work here. Women were not allowed to participate in most physical activities that might generate body heat. They were confined to indoor sedentary roles. They were dressed in multiple layers of heavy clothing. They were discouraged from eating heartily or drinking wine freely. Those were masculine indulgences. And then, when they exhibited symptoms of depression, lethargy or sadness, symptoms that might well result from such restrictive, unfulfilling lives, physicians diagnosed them with an excess of cold and moist humours and prescribed marriage as the cure. The system created the problem it claimed to solve, but the humoral explanation for female emotions went even further than simple temperature and moisture. Medieval physicians developed elaborate theories about how these qualities affected every aspect of women's lives. They taught that women's cold, moist brains made them less capable of rational thought. Heat, you see, was associated with mental clarity and intellectual vigour. Coldness dulled the mind, made it slower, more prone to confusion. This was presented not as prejudice, but as medical fact, backed by centuries of authoritative texts. They explained that women's watery nature made them more impressionable, more easily swayed by emotions and external influences. A hot, dry male mind was firm and stable like baked clay. A cold, wet female mind was soft and changeable like damp earth that could be easily moulded. This made women unsuitable for leadership, legal testimony, or independent decision-making. Their humours simply would not allow for the kind of steady, rational judgment required for such responsibilities. And here is something that should make your blood boil just a little. When men exhibited emotional behaviour, crying, expressing fear, showing vulnerability, physicians sometimes diagnosed them with an excess of female humours. Yes, you read that right. If a man was too emotional, the medical explanation was that he had somehow become too feminine, too cold and moist, too much like a woman. The cure? Warming treatments, vigorous exercise, red meat, and activities that would restore his proper hot and dry, masculine balance. Emotions themselves were literally gendered in medical theory. Medieval women had to navigate this impossible framework every single day. Feeling sad? Your humours are imbalanced. Feeling angry? Your humours are imbalanced. Feeling exhausted from doing all the domestic labour while your husband makes all the decisions? Still a humour imbalance. Every emotional response to genuinely difficult circumstances was medicalised, pathologised, and blamed on female biology. The system gave women no room to have legitimate emotional reactions to their lives because their cold, wet nature meant their emotions were always suspect, always potentially a sign of medical dysfunction. But wait, there is more, because the medieval period added another layer to all of this. Menstruation itself became even more heavily theorized through the lens of humoral medicine. In early modern Europe, spanning roughly the 14th through 17th centuries, physicians developed incredibly detailed theories about menstrual blood and what it signified about a woman's humoral state. They believed that the womb could not be too cold, too hot, too moist, or too dry without affecting fertility. It had to maintain a perfect balance, warm enough, but not too warm, moist enough, but not too moist. Menstruation was seen as the body's attempt to maintain this balance by purging excess cold and moist humours. Women who did not menstruate regularly were thought to be in serious danger, because those cold, moist fluids would accumulate inside them, growing more toxic and dangerous with each passing month. This led to some truly bizarre medical interventions. When a woman's periods were irregular or absent, a condition called amenorrhea, physicians would prescribe aggressive warming treatments. They gave women aphrodisiacs, not for pleasure but because such substances were believed to have strong heating effects that would stimulate menstruation and restore humoral balance. They prescribed mustard plasters applied to the lower abdomen. They recommended hot baths infused with warming herbs. They even suggested that women smell pungent, heating substances to draw the menstrual blood downward through the power of their vapours. And if a woman's periods were too heavy, well, that indicated an excess of cold and moist humours that needed to be dried out. She might be bled from the arm, yes, deliberately removing more blood from someone already losing blood monthly, on the theory that bloodletting would help rebalance her humours. The logic was that by controlling where and how blood left the body, physicians could influence the overall humoral balance. It was like trying to fix a leaking boat by drilling more holes in strategic locations. Exhausting just to think about. Now here is a detail that really captures the absurdity. Medieval physicians also theorized about what happened to women who did not menstruate for reasons other than pregnancy. Older women past menopause were considered especially dangerous because they retained all those cold, moist, potentially toxic humours inside their bodies. The medical text The Secrets of Women that I mentioned earlier actually warned that postmenopausal women who looked at infants could poison them with their gaze. The retained menstrual blood, unable to escape, would supposedly generate evil humours that emanated from the woman's eyes and could sicken children. Imagine being an older woman, blamed for being near babies, all because of a wild theory about toxic vapours and unbalanced humours. The staying power of humoral theory is genuinely remarkable. It was not just some fringe belief held by a few eccentric physicians. This was mainstream, respectable, university-taught medicine from ancient Greece straight through to the 17th century. That is over 2,000 years of medical professionals being trained to view women as constitutionally colder, wetter, less rational, more emotional, and fundamentally imbalanced compared to men. Generation after generation of doctors, all learning the same framework, all prescribing the same treatments, all reinforcing the same prejudices dressed up as science. And the cruel irony? Some of the symptoms these women experienced were probably real. Living in a society that denied you education, property rights, legal standing, and personal freedom would absolutely cause stress, anxiety, and depression. Being married off young to a stranger might indeed make you sad. Having no control over your own life could certainly lead to feelings of helplessness and despair. But instead of questioning the social structures that created these conditions, physicians looked at suffering women and said, "Ah yes, too much phlegm. Definitely a cold and moist condition. Try eating more warm foods and having more relations with your husband." The humoral theory of female emotions was like a pair of tinted glasses that medieval society refused to take off. Everything about women was filtered through this lens of cold and moist versus hot and dry. It explained why women could not be priests. Their cold humours made them unfit for sacred duties. It explained why they could not be warriors. Their moist nature made them physically weak. It explained why they should not be educated. Their damp brains could not handle the heat of rigorous study. One simple theory with tendrils reaching into every aspect of women's lives, all based on the observation that men and women are different, and the completely unscientific leap that different must mean imbalanced. But even as humoral theory dominated medical thought, society was changing in ways that would add new layers to the explanation of female emotions. Because if women were already seen as cold, wet, and constitutionally unstable, what would happen when religious authorities started weighing in on women's nature? What would happen when the church decided that women's emotional and physical symptoms might not be medical at all, but spiritual? The answer involves demons, exorcisms, and witch trials. And that is exactly where this story takes its darkest turn. Picture this. You are a woman living in medieval Europe, perhaps in the 13th century. You've been feeling deeply sad for weeks. You cry without apparent reason. You feel a tightness in your chest that will not go away. Perhaps you have been having strange dreams or experiencing moments when you feel disconnected from your own body. You finally gather the courage to seek help. But instead of a physician checking your humours or diagnosing a wandering womb, you find yourself face to face with a priest. And the diagnosis he delivers is far more terrifying than any medical condition. You are possessed by demons. This is where our story takes a genuinely dark turn, because somewhere between the 5th and 13th centuries, the medical understanding of female emotions underwent a dramatic transformation. The Roman Empire had fallen. The Christian Church was rising to unprecedented power across Europe, and as the Church's influence grew, so did a new explanation for women's suffering, one that had nothing to do with wandering wombs or imbalanced humours, and everything to do with the battle between God and the devil for human souls. The shift happened gradually but inexorably. St. Augustine, one of the most influential theologians in Christian history, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, taught that human suffering was fundamentally linked to sin. Pain, illness, and emotional distress were not just biological events. They were consequences of humanity's fallen nature, punishments for transgression, or tests of faith sent by God. This theological framework began seeping into every aspect of medieval life, including medicine. Now, physicians had always struggled to explain certain symptoms. When a woman experienced seizures, heard voices, felt intense fear or rage, or exhibited behaviours that seemed beyond her control, humoral theory could only go so far in providing answers. The treatments, warming foods, bloodletting, herbal remedies, sometimes seemed to make no difference at all. But if the cause was not medical, if it was spiritual, then suddenly these mysterious symptoms made perfect sense. The woman was not sick. She was possessed. The church taught that demons were real, active entities constantly seeking to corrupt and destroy human souls, and according to medieval theology, certain types of people were more vulnerable to demonic attack than others. Can you guess who topped that list? Women. Particularly women who were already viewed with suspicion: the unmarried, the widowed, the elderly, the poor, the independent. Women who exhibited what society deemed inappropriate behaviour, speaking out, refusing to marry, showing anger, expressing opinions, were especially suspect. The reasoning, if you can call it that, went something like this. Women were weaker vessels, both physically and spiritually. Remember, they had already been classified as colder, wetter, less rational than men. The church added another layer. Women were also more morally weak, more susceptible to temptation, more easily led astray. Eve, after all, had been the first to sin in the Garden of Eden, or so the story went. Women's very nature made them vulnerable to demonic influence. Their emotional displays, tears, outbursts, expressions of distress, were not symptoms of genuine suffering, but potential signs of possession. Let me share with you what this looked like in practice. A young woman begins experiencing what we might today recognize as a panic attack. Rapid heartbeat, difficulty breathing, intense fear, a sense that something terrible is about to happen. In our time, she might be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder and offered therapy or medication. In medieval Europe, a priest might interpret these symptoms as evidence of demonic oppression. The racing heart? The demon was agitating her soul. The breathlessness. Evil spirits were suffocating her. The fear? A natural response to the presence of unholy entities within her body. Or consider a woman suffering from what we now understand as depression. She has lost interest in daily activities. She feels overwhelming sadness. She struggles to eat or sleep. She speaks of feeling worthless, hopeless, as though a dark cloud has settled over her life. The medieval diagnosis: demonic influence or possession. The devil, they taught, wanted to drive people to despair because despair led to sin, and sin led souls away from God. A woman in the grip of such darkness was clearly under attack. The prescribed treatments were radically different from medical interventions. Instead of herbs and bloodletting, the church offered prayers, holy water, blessed amulets, and in severe cases, exorcism. Exorcism was a formal ritual in which a priest would attempt to cast out the demon believed to be inhabiting the afflicted person's body. It involved prayers, commands issued to the demon, sometimes fasting by both the exorcist and the possessed person, and could last for hours or even days. Imagine being that woman. You're suffering, genuinely suffering from what might be depression, anxiety, trauma, or any number of psychological conditions. You seek help, and instead of receiving comfort or understanding, you're told that your body has become a battleground for supernatural forces. You are subjected to long, exhausting rituals during which you are treated not as a person in need of care, but as a vessel containing evil that must be purged. The psychological impact of such treatment is difficult to even contemplate. But here is where it gets even darker, and I want you to really think about this. The line between possessed and witch was distressingly thin. A woman exhibiting strange behaviours or unexplained symptoms might be viewed as a victim of demonic possession, someone to be pitied and helped. Or she might be viewed as a willing participant in witchcraft, someone who had deliberately invited demons into her life through pacts with the devil. And that distinction often came down to subjective judgments about her character, her reputation, her social standing. By the late Middle Ages, especially during the 15th through 17th centuries, Europe was gripped by what historians now call the witch hunts or witch trials. Tens of thousands of people, the vast majority of them women, were accused of witchcraft, tried, and often executed. The charges varied, but many involved claims that the accused woman had caused harm through supernatural means, making crops fail, causing livestock to sicken, making men impotent, or afflicting people with mysterious illnesses. And here is the connection to our story. Many of the symptoms of witchcraft were identical to the symptoms previously attributed to hysteria, wandering wombs or humoral imbalances. A woman who was moody, who spoke her mind, who showed anger or grief too openly, who had conflicts with neighbours, who owned property that others coveted, who practiced folk medicine or midwifery. Any of these could mark her as suspicious. Her emotions, her independence, her knowledge, all became potential evidence of diabolical association. The most infamous text from this period is the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. This book, which went through dozens of editions and was used as a handbook for witch hunters across Europe, contains some of the most explicitly misogynistic writing in Western history. It argues at length that women are naturally more inclined toward witchcraft than men because of their inferior nature, their greater susceptibility to passions, their insatiable carnal desires, and their weaker intellect. The Malleus Maleficarum specifically links female sexuality and emotion to demonic vulnerability. It claims that women's lust, which the authors viewed as excessive and dangerous, made them perfect targets for the devil's recruitment. A woman who enjoyed sex too much, or who seemed too emotional, or who displayed what the authors deemed inappropriate anger or independence was potentially a witch. The book essentially took all the existing prejudices about female nature and weaponized them. One particularly chilling section discusses how witches allegedly had the power to make male genitals disappear. Yes, you read that correctly. The text describes men who claimed that witches had magically removed or hidden their penises, sometimes claiming the witches kept collections of penises in birds' nests in trees. Scholars today recognize this as a manifestation of cultural anxieties about female power and male virility. But at the time, these claims were taken seriously and could lead to a woman's execution. Think about what this meant for women experiencing genuine emotional or mental distress. You are a widow, grieving the loss of your husband. Your sadness lasts for months, as grief naturally does. But your neighbours whisper that your prolonged melancholy is unnatural, a sign of something sinister. Or perhaps you are an older woman living alone, known for your knowledge of herbs and healing. When a child in the village falls ill and you offer a remedy, but the child does not immediately improve, suddenly you are suspect. Your knowledge becomes evidence of unnatural powers. Your independence becomes proof of diabolical allegiance. Or imagine this scenario, documented in actual trial records. You are a young woman who begins experiencing seizures. Your body convulses. You speak in voices that do not sound like your own. You have visions. In another time, these might have been attributed to epilepsy or another neurological condition. But during the witch hunts, such symptoms could be interpreted in two ways. Either you were possessed by demons sent by a witch, in which case you were a victim, or you were a witch yourself, faking possession or using supernatural powers. Either way, the focus was on demons and the devil, not on your actual health or well-being. The trials themselves were nightmares of injustice. Accused women were often tortured to extract confessions. The legal procedures assumed guilt rather than innocence. Evidence that would never be accepted in other types of trials, dreams, rumours, spectral evidence, accusations from children, was treated as credible in witchcraft cases, and once accused, a woman faced an almost impossible situation. Confess, and you might be executed as a witch. Refuse to confess, and you might be tortured further or executed for being obstinate and unrepentant. there was often no way out. Now, I want to be clear about something. Not all medieval and early modern people believed in the witch hunts. There were skeptics, including some physicians and theologians, who argued that the accused women were mentally ill or suffering from natural diseases, not possessed or practicing witchcraft. But these voices of reason were often drowned out by the hysteria, and yes, that word again, that gripped communities during witch panics. What is particularly heartbreaking is recognizing that many of the women accused and executed were likely suffering from conditions we now understand quite well. A woman having seizures might have had epilepsy. A woman hearing voices might have been experiencing schizophrenia or severe trauma. A woman who seemed confused and spoke nonsense might have had dementia or a brain injury. A woman who behaved erratically might have had bipolar disorder or been responding rationally to abuse. But instead of receiving help, these women were branded as evil, cast out and often killed. The emotional toll of living in such an environment is almost impossible to imagine. Every woman had to carefully monitor her own behavior, her expressions, her words. Show too much grief and you might be suspect. Show too much joy and you might seem unnatural. Express anger and you are definitely dangerous. Be too knowledgeable, too independent, too different, and you could find yourself accused. The witch hunts essentially criminalize female emotion and female autonomy, turning every expression of selfhood into potential evidence of evil. And here is something that should make you pause. The witch hunts did not end because society suddenly decided women deserved better treatment, or because people stopped believing in demons. They ended gradually, because the Enlightenment brought new ways of thinking about the natural world, because legal systems began demanding better evidence, and because the sheer scale of the executions eventually horrified enough people to demand reform. But the underlying attitudes about women, their weakness, their emotionality, their susceptibility to irrationality, those attitudes persisted. By the late 17th century, as the witch trials began to decline in most of Europe, physicians and scholars were looking for new frameworks to understand female behavior. They wanted to move away from supernatural explanations and return to natural ones. But as we will see, moving away from demons did not mean moving toward genuine understanding or compassion. Instead, society found new ways to pathologize female emotions, new systems to control and contain women's expressions of distress. The demons might be gone from the diagnosis, but the underlying belief that something was fundamentally wrong with women's emotional nature remained firmly in place. The shift from demonic possession back to medical explanations did bring some improvements. At least women were no longer being burned at the stake for having seizures or hearing voices. But the new medical theories that emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries would carry forward many of the same prejudices, just dressed in scientific rather than religious language. The vocabulary changed, but the message remained remarkably consistent. Women's emotions were excessive, untrustworthy, and needed to be controlled by male authority, whether that authority wore the robes of a priest or the coat of a physician. And speaking of physicians, they were about to get creative again. Because if the problem was not demons and not just wandering wombs or cold humours, then what was it? Some doctors decided the issue must be specifically sexual. They developed theories about female sexuality and reproduction that would make the wandering womb seem almost reasonable by comparison. These theories would dominate medical thinking through the Renaissance and beyond, and yes, they were just as absurd as everything we have discussed so far. In fact, they might take the prize for sheer audacity in explaining female emotions through the lens of sexual frustration and reproductive dysfunction, and that is exactly where we are heading next. As Europe emerged from the darkness of the witch trials and entered the Renaissance, a period celebrated for its rediscovery of classical learning and scientific inquiry, you might expect that understanding of female emotions would improve. After all, this was an age of enlightenment, of art, of humanistic thinking. Surely physicians would develop more compassionate, more accurate explanations for women's suffering. Well, I have some news for you, and you might want to brace yourself, because what came next was somehow both more medicalized and yet just as absurd as everything that came before. Renaissance physicians decided that the real problem with women's emotions could be summed up in one simple diagnosis: not enough semen. Yes, you heard that correctly. Welcome to the era when lack of male seed was considered not just a reproductive issue, but a serious medical emergency that could quite literally drive women insane. And this was not some fringe theory. This was respectable, university-taught medicine embraced by some of the most prominent physicians of the 16th and 17th centuries. The theory built on ideas we have touched on before. Remember how Hippocrates suggested that the uterus wandered when deprived of male seed? Renaissance physicians took that concept and expanded it into an elaborate framework. But they added a fascinating twist. They theorized that women, like men, produced their own reproductive seed or fluid. This female seed was necessary for conception, they believed, and it needed to be released regularly through sexual climax, just as male seed did. If a woman did not experience regular release of this female seed, it would accumulate in her womb, stagnate, and literally turn poisonous. This condition even had a name: the widow's disease. The term tells you everything you need to know about who was considered most at risk. Widows, of course, but also any woman without regular access to sexual relations. Unmarried women, nuns, women whose husbands were away for extended periods, and women whose husbands were, shall we say, not particularly attentive to their wives' needs. All these women were theoretically walking around with dangerous levels of toxic, unreleased female seed building up inside them. The symptoms attributed to this condition read like a comprehensive list of every possible human emotional state: anxiety, widow's disease, depression, definitely widow's disease, irritability, classic widow's disease, restlessness, insomnia, loss of appetite, fatigue, excessive energy, tearfulness, anger, fearfulness. Literally any emotional or physical symptom a woman might experience could be traced back to this supposed accumulation of unspent seed. It was the ultimate catch-all diagnosis, explaining everything while actually explaining nothing. Now let me introduce you to some of the physicians who championed this theory. Giovanni Matteo Ferrari da Gradi, an Italian physician from the 15th century, wrote extensively about how marriage and childbearing could cure what he called the diseases of women. But here is the crucial detail. He specified that if pleasure was obtained from sexual relations, then the woman's symptoms would disappear. If no pleasure, no cure. This was actually quite a radical statement for its time because it acknowledged, albeit in a deeply medicalized way, that female sexual satisfaction mattered. But do not mistake this for progressive thinking. Ferrari da Gradi was not concerned with women's pleasure for its own sake or as a matter of human dignity and happiness. No, he cared about it because he believed it was medically necessary to prevent illness. Female orgasm was prescribed like we might prescribe antibiotics today, as a clinical intervention to address a pathological condition. The pleasure itself was the medicine, and marriage was simply the delivery system. Other physicians built elaborate theories about exactly what happened to this unreleased female seed. They taught that when female seed was not regularly expelled, it would begin to putrefy inside the womb. As it rotted, it would release toxic vapors that would rise through the woman's body, affecting her heart, her lungs, and most importantly her brain. These poisonous fumes would cloud her thinking, darken her moods, and cause all manner of psychological and physical symptoms. One medical text from 1637 explained, with complete seriousness, that when sexual fluids were not regularly released, the heart and surrounding areas are enveloped in a morbid and moist exudation. Think about the implications here. Women were being told that their emotional distress was literally caused by sexual deprivation. Feeling sad after your husband died? Not grief, just toxic seed vapors affecting your brain. Feeling frustrated and confined as a nun bound by vows of chastity? Not a rational response to restricted freedom, just dangerous accumulation of reproductive fluids. The theory took women's legitimate emotional responses to difficult life circumstances and reduced them to a plumbing problem. And the treatments? Well, the primary prescription was exactly what you would expect: marriage and regular sexual intercourse. Physicians wrote detailed prescriptions about the frequency of relations needed to maintain proper health. Some suggested weekly, others more often, depending on the woman's age, constitution, and severity of symptoms. The husband's duty was not just social or religious, but medical. He was in effect dispensing therapeutic treatments to his wife through regular sexual congress. But what about women who did not have husbands? Here is where things get truly remarkable. For unmarried women, widows and nuns suffering from symptoms attributed to unreleased female seed, the medical profession developed an alternative treatment: manual stimulation performed by midwives. Yes, we are talking about medically prescribed genital massage. This was not considered sexual. It was framed as purely therapeutic, a medical procedure to release the dangerous fluids and restore the woman's health. Historical records from this period describe midwives visiting convents to provide this service to nuns experiencing symptoms. Imagine being a nun, committed to a life of celibacy and spiritual devotion, suffering from what we might today recognize as depression or anxiety, perhaps caused by the very restrictions of convent life, only to be told that the cure involves a midwife manually stimulating you to climax. The psychological complexity of such a situation is almost impossible to fully grasp from our modern perspective. The treatments often involved oils and scented substances, echoing the ancient Egyptian practice of using smells to influence the uterus. But now the purpose was not to lure a wandering womb back into place. Instead, the oils were meant to facilitate the massage and perhaps to help induce the release of pent-up fluids. Medical texts from the period discuss which oils were most effective, how long the treatment should last, and how to know when sufficient release had been achieved. There were also devices. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, some midwives and physicians used mechanical aids to assist with this therapeutic stimulation. These were not yet the electric vibrators that would come later. Those would not be invented until the 1880s, but they were manual tools designed to make the process less labor-intensive for the practitioner. Think of them as early medical instruments, no different in principle from forceps or scalpels, except that their purpose was to bring women to orgasm for therapeutic reasons. Now, here is something fascinating. During this same period, physicians also taught that semen itself, male semen, had healing properties beyond just preventing the accumulation of female seed. They believed that male seed, when introduced into the female body through intercourse, acted as a kind of medicine in its own right. It was thought to warm the womb, nourish the organs, calm the nerves, and restore balance to the female constitution. Some medical texts describe semen as having almost miraculous properties, able to cure a wide range of ailments from melancholy to physical weakness. This belief led to some truly strange prescriptions. Physicians adamantly opposed all forms of contraception, arguing that preventing semen from entering the womb was medically dangerous for women. Withdrawal, barrier methods, Any attempt to prevent conception was framed not just as morally wrong from a religious perspective, but as medically harmful. A woman who practiced contraception was supposedly depriving herself of the healing influence of male seed, putting her health at serious risk. The class dynamics of all this are worth examining. These theories and treatments were most commonly applied to middle and upper class women who had the resources to consult physicians and hire midwives. Poor women, peasant women, women working in fields or factories were dealing with their emotional and physical complaints, or more likely just enduring them without access to these elaborate medical frameworks. Which raises an interesting question. Were upper-class women actually experiencing more symptoms, or were they simply more able to seek treatment? Or perhaps the very leisure and restriction that came with wealth created the conditions for the symptoms these theories purported to explain. Think about an aristocratic woman in Renaissance Italy or France. Her life was heavily restricted by social conventions. She could not work, could not travel freely, could not make significant decisions about her own life. She was expected to be decorative, submissive, and focused entirely on domestic concerns. Her education, if she received one at all, was limited. Her social interactions were constrained. Her movements were monitored. Is it any wonder such a woman might experience anxiety, depression, or general malaise? But instead of questioning whether the lifestyle itself might be the problem, physicians diagnosed a sexual deficiency and prescribed marital relations as the cure. There is also something deeply troubling about how these theories positioned women's bodies as always lacking, always in need of masculine input to function properly. A man's body was complete unto itself, self-sufficient, balanced, healthy. A woman's body required regular infusions of male seed to maintain equilibrium. Without it, she would literally sicken mentally and physically. This was not just a medical theory, it was a metaphor that reinforced every social hierarchy of the period. Women needed men the way the sick need medicine, the way the broken need fixing. Yet buried within these bizarre theories is something we might almost recognize as progress, however twisted its form. Renaissance physicians were at least acknowledging that female sexual satisfaction existed and had physiological effects. They were recognizing, in their limited way, that sexual frustration could contribute to psychological distress. These insights were real, even if the framework surrounding them was fundamentally flawed. The famous physician Gabriele Falloppio, yes, the man the fallopian tubes are named after, wrote in the mid-16th century about the importance of mutual pleasure in marital relations. He argued that conception was more likely when the woman experienced pleasure, and that marriages were happier when both partners found satisfaction. Of course, he framed all this in terms of medical necessity and proper reproductive function, not in terms of women's inherent right to pleasure or happiness. But still, the acknowledgement was there. Other physicians of this era began making careful observations about female anatomy. They described the clitoris in medical texts, noting its sensitivity and its role in female pleasure. Some even argued that the clitoris served no reproductive function and existed purely for pleasure, a remarkably perceptive observation. But again, this knowledge was filtered through the lens of pathology. Female pleasure mattered because its absence caused disease, not because women deserved pleasure as autonomous human beings. The 17th century saw these ideas reach their peak of influence. Medical textbooks across Europe taught the theory of dangerous accumulating female seed. Midwives were trained in the techniques of therapeutic stimulation. Physicians wrote lengthy treatises on the widow's disease and its treatments. And all of this was presented as respectable science, the best medical knowledge available. But as we move toward the 18th century, something interesting starts to happen. The Enlightenment is bringing new ways of thinking about the body and the mind. Physicians are beginning to question old authorities and develop new theories based on observation and reason, rather than just ancient texts. The focus is starting to shift from the womb and reproductive organs to a different part of the body entirely. Where might that be? Well, if you've been following the trajectory of these theories, you might guess. The nervous system. Physicians were about to discover that women's emotions were not caused by wandering wombs, demonic possession, or lack of semen. No, the new explanation would be that women simply had weaker, more delicate nerves than men, and this nervous fragility would explain everything from fainting spells to emotional outbursts. But before we get there, we need to talk about what happened when this nervous fragility combined with the fashion and beauty standards of the Victorian era, because that combination would create one of the most iconic images of female emotional excess in all of history. The swooning, fainting Victorian lady with her smelling salts and her fainting couch. And trust me, the reality behind that image is far more interesting and far more layered than you might imagine. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a Victorian drawing room. The year is 1850, somewhere in London or New York. The room is filled with heavy furniture, thick curtains, layers upon layers of fabric everywhere. A group of well-dressed people are engaged in polite conversation when suddenly a young woman places her hand to her forehead, sways slightly and collapses gracefully onto a nearby sofa. Someone cries out, "Fetch the smelling salts!" A small decorative bottle is produced, waved under her nose, and within moments she revives, apologizing softly for the disruption. This scene played out thousands of times across the Western world during the 19th century. But here is the question that should make you curious. Were these women actually fainting, or was something else entirely going on? The Victorian era, spanning roughly from 1837 to 1901 during Queen Victoria's reign, gave us an image of femininity that persists in our cultural imagination to this day. The delicate, fragile lady who could be overcome by the slightest shock or emotion. Fainting became so associated with proper ladylike behaviour that wealthy homes actually had special rooms called fainting rooms, furnished with fainting couches, specifically designed for women to recover from their swooning spells in private. Let that sink in for a moment. Society built entire rooms dedicated to the expectation that women would regularly lose consciousness. But to understand why fainting became such a phenomenon, we need to talk about what Victorian society called the vapours. This was not a new term, it had been used for centuries, but the Victorians embraced it with particular enthusiasm. The vapours referred to a constellation of symptoms that could strike a woman at any moment. Dizziness, anxiety, breathlessness, heart palpitations, trembling, crying, depression, irritability, and of course fainting. The theory behind the name was that these symptoms were caused by vapours, noxious fumes rising from a woman's reproductive organs, particularly the uterus, and affecting her heart, lungs, and brain. Notice how we keep coming back to the uterus? Even in the 19th century, after thousands of years of medical progress, physicians were still fundamentally convinced that women's reproductive organs were the source of all their emotional and physical complaints. The vocabulary had changed, the explanations had gotten more elaborate, but the basic premise remained stubbornly the same. Now let us talk about corsets, because you cannot discuss Victorian fainting without addressing the elephant in the room, or rather, the whalebone around the rib cage. Victorian women, particularly those of the middle and upper classes, wore corsets as a standard part of their daily dress, and we're not talking about the gentle, supportive undergarments some people wear today. Victorian corsets, especially during the height of the tight-lacing fad, were instruments of compression that could dramatically reshape the body. A corset was constructed from heavy, tightly woven fabric with channels sewn throughout. Into these channels went boning, strips of whalebone, steel or wood, that created a rigid structure. The corset laced up the back, and the laces could be pulled tighter and tighter until the woman's waist measured substantially less than its natural size. Some women pursued waist measurements of 18 inches, 16 inches, or even smaller. To put that in perspective, the average woman's natural waist today measures somewhere between 27 and 33 inches. We are talking about reducing the waist by a third or more. What happened to the body under such compression? Well, the rib cage was forced inward. The lungs had less space to expand. The diaphragm could not move properly. Internal organs were literally squeezed and displaced. The liver, stomach, and intestines were pushed downward or backward, pressing against the spine. One Victorian woman wrote in her diary, "I had only eaten 2 bites of my biscuit when I realized there was no room beneath my corset for a third." Imagine trying to digest food, or breathe deeply, or do anything requiring physical exertion while your organs were compressed in a rigid cage. The medical consequences were exactly what you would expect. Women who tight-lace their corsets experience shortness of breath, particularly when trying to exert themselves or when in warm, crowded rooms. They could not take deep breaths, which meant their blood was not being properly oxygenated. They had difficulty eating adequate amounts of food, which led to nutritional deficiencies and weakness. Their hearts had to work harder to pump the blood through compressed vessels. And yes, all of this could absolutely lead to fainting, especially in certain situations. Picture a Victorian social event, a ball, a dinner party, a church service. The room is packed with people, all generating body heat. Women are wearing multiple layers of heavy clothing, including petticoats, crinolines, the corset, a dress, possibly a jacket or shawl. The men are wearing multiple layers too, and the room is lit by candles or gas lamps, which generate even more heat. There is no air conditioning, possibly inadequate ventilation. Now add to this a woman who has been corseted so tightly she can barely breathe, who perhaps has not eaten much because eating is uncomfortable in a corset, who has been standing for extended periods because sitting down in a heavily corseted and petticoated outfit is its own challenge. Is it any wonder she might feel faint? But corsets were not the only culprit. Victorian women were also being slowly poisoned by their beauty regimen. This is where the story takes a turn that might genuinely shock you. Arsenic, a deadly poison, was everywhere in Victorian life. It was in the wallpaper. By the late 19th century, approximately 80% of all wallpaper contained arsenic-based dyes that created beautiful greens and other colours. It was in fabric dyes, particularly the vibrant greens and blues that were fashionable. It was in cosmetics, where arsenic was used to create a pale, translucent complexion that was considered the height of beauty. Women literally painted poison onto their faces. They wore dresses dyed with arsenic. They sat in rooms surrounded by arsenic-laced wallpaper, breathing in tiny particles of the substance day after day. And arsenic poisoning? Its symptoms include headaches, cold sweats, dizziness, weakness, confusion, tremors, and fainting. One documented case from 1880 described a woman who experienced fainting fits almost daily while living in one room of her house. When she was moved to a different room, one without arsenic wallpaper, her fainting spells stopped completely within 6 weeks. Lead was another common toxin. It was in hair dyes, giving Victorian women the dark, lustrous hair that was so prized. It was in wine, where lead was sometimes added to improve flavour or preserve the product. It was in water pipes. Lead poisoning causes fatigue, irritability, headaches, weakness and nervous system damage. Mercury was in cosmetics, particularly skin-whitening creams. Mercury poisoning causes tremors, emotional instability, and fatigue. The wealthier you were, the more access you had to these toxic beauty products. and therefore the more likely you were to experience the symptoms attributed to the vapours. Think about the irony here. Women were fainting, experiencing dizziness and weakness, feeling anxious and unwell, but rather than looking at the obvious physical causes, compression of vital organs, chronic poisoning, restrictive clothing, inadequate nutrition, physicians diagnosed it as a female nervous condition, the vapours, hysteria, a manifestation of women's inherently delicate and unstable nature. And so they treated fainting with smelling salts, those little bottles that Victorian women carried with them everywhere. Smelling salts were made from ammonium carbonate, often mixed with perfume or dissolved in vinegar. When you opened the bottle and inhaled, you got a powerful blast of ammonia gas. This gas irritated the mucous membranes of your nose and throat, triggering an inhalation reflex. Your breathing pattern changed immediately. Your airways cleared. Your respiratory rate increased, sending more oxygen to your brain. It was actually quite effective for reversing a faint, but it addressed the symptom, not the cause. The bottles themselves were often beautiful, ornate vinaigrettes made of gold, silver, or other precious metals, sometimes decorated with enamel or gemstones. They were fashion accessories as much as medical necessities. A lady's vinaigrette said something about her status, her refinement, her femininity. Carrying smelling salts was a signal that you were the kind of delicate, sensitive woman who might need them. In some social circles, fainting became almost fashionable, a way to demonstrate that you possessed the refined sensibility expected of a proper lady. But here is where the story gets really interesting, and this is something I want you to really consider. Many historians now believe that a significant portion of Victorian fainting was performative. Not all of it, certainly. Women with tightly laced corsets in overheated room absolutely could and did genuinely faint. Women being slowly poisoned by arsenic and lead genuinely felt dizzy and weak. But fainting also became a strategic tool, a socially acceptable way for women to express distress, avoid uncomfortable situations, or gain attention and care. Think about it from a Victorian woman's perspective. You live in a society with incredibly rigid rules about female behaviour. You cannot express anger openly. That would be unladylike. You cannot argue with men, especially your husband or father. You cannot refuse social obligations or speak your mind freely. You cannot leave a conversation or a room without a proper excuse. You have very little control over your own life. But if you faint, suddenly everything stops. People rush to help you. You're excused from whatever situation you are in. You are taken to a quiet room to recover. You receive sympathy and attention. You have successfully extracted yourself from an unwanted situation while maintaining your reputation as a proper delicate lady. Some women almost certainly used fainting as a form of rebellion, a way to assert some small measure of control in a world that gave them very little. Others might have used it to avoid confrontations, difficult conversations, or unwanted interactions. Still others might have found that fainting brought them the care and attention they craved but could not ask for directly. Charles Dickens, that keen observer of Victorian society, actually satirised this in his novels. In Martin Chuzzlewit, he created a character named Mrs. Gamp who could wilt on demand, using feigned fainting spells to manipulate those around her. The police constables of Victorian London actually carried small vials of smelling salts as standard equipment, specifically to assist ladies who fainted in the streets. Think about that. Public safety officials were equipped to deal with the epidemic of fainting women. It was such a common occurrence that it required an institutional response. Victorian medical texts took fainting very seriously as a symptom of female nervous disorders. Physicians wrote extensively about what they called nervous exhaustion, neurasthenia and hysteria, all conditions supposedly characterized by a weakness of the female nervous system. They believed that women's nerves were simply more delicate, more easily overstimulated, more prone to collapse under stress than men's nerves. This was presented as biological fact supported by centuries of medical authority. The prescribed treatments reflected this belief. Rest was the primary prescription, not just a good night's sleep, but extended periods of complete rest. Some physicians recommended weeks or months of bed rest for women suffering from nervous complaints. They advised against reading novels, which were thought to overstimulate the female imagination. They discouraged physical exercise beyond gentle walks. They warned against too much excitement or emotion. The cure for fainting and nervous disorders was to live an even more restricted, even more passive life than Victorian society already demanded. But there were dissenters. Some physicians began to argue that the problem was not women's inherent weakness, but their circumstances. In the late 19th century, a few progressive doctors suggested that perhaps women fainted because they were malnourished due to corsets making eating difficult. Perhaps they fainted because they were denied fresh air and exercise. Perhaps they fainted because they were bored, frustrated, and confined to suffocatingly limited roles. These voices were rare, but they existed. There is also a fascinating class dimension to all of this. Working-class women, women who laboured in factories, on farms, in domestic service, rarely had the luxury of fainting. Oh, they experienced all the same emotions, all the same stresses, often far more intensely than their wealthier counterparts. They faced poverty, exhausting labour, dangerous working conditions, exploitation. But working women could not afford to faint. They could not afford smelling salts or fainting rooms or extended rest cures. They simply had to keep going. Which suggests that fainting was, at least partially, a phenomenon of privilege, enabled by leisure and resources that most women simply did not have. The Victorian fainting phenomenon also reveals something about how societies deal with women's emotions more broadly. When women expressed distress directly, through anger, through argument, through refusing to comply with expectations, they were punished, labelled as difficult, unfeminine, hysterical. But when women expressed distress indirectly, through physical symptoms, through fainting, through being passive and sick, they received care and sympathy. Victorian society essentially trained women that the only acceptable way to express suffering was through the body, not through words or actions. And that training had lasting effects. Even today, studies show that women are more likely than men to express psychological distress through physical symptoms. When stressed or depressed, women are more likely to report headaches, stomach problems, fatigue, and pain. Some researchers trace this pattern directly back to generations of socialization teaching women that physical illness was more acceptable, more believable, more deserving of care than emotional distress. As the 19th century drew to a close, attitudes slowly began to shift. More physicians started questioning whether all these fainting women really had weak nerves or whether something else might be going on. The tight-lacing fad began to decline as dress reform movements gained traction. Women started demanding more practical clothing, more freedom of movement, more access to exercise and education, and mysteriously, as women's lives became less restricted, the epidemic of fainting began to decline. By the 1920s, fainting as a common social phenomenon had largely disappeared. Funny how that worked out. But the belief that women were emotionally and physically weaker than men, that particular idea proved much harder to kill. Because just as fainting was declining, the medical establishment was getting ready to embrace a whole new set of theories about female emotional instability. And these theories would be even more elaborate, even more pseudoscientific, and even more influential. They would involve new diagnoses with impressive-sounding medical names. They would pathologize perfectly normal female experiences, and they would create an entire industry around treating women for conditions that, as we will discover, often had more to do with societal oppression than actual disease. That industry, and the bizarre theories behind it, are where we turn next. Because if you thought arsenic-laced cosmetics and strategic fainting were strange, just wait until you hear about the illness that supposedly turned young women literally green. There once existed a disease that afflicted thousands of young women across Europe and America throughout the 19th century. The symptoms were unmistakable: a peculiar greenish pallor to the skin, profound exhaustion, loss of appetite, heart palpitations, shortness of breath, and most tellingly, deep melancholy and emotional instability. Physicians called it chlorosis, from the Greek word for green. The common folk had a more evocative name, green sickness, and for over 300 years this mysterious condition was diagnosed, studied, treated, and debated by the medical establishment. Then, quite suddenly in the early 20th century, it vanished. Not gradually, not through improved treatment, but simply disappeared as though it had never existed at all. How does an entire disease just cease to exist? The answer tells us everything we need to know about how society has historically used medicine to explain and control female emotions. Let us travel back to the late 1500s, when chlorosis first began appearing in medical literature as a distinct condition. The disease seemed to strike primarily young women between the ages of 15 and 25. These were girls on the cusp of adulthood, either just beginning menstruation or experiencing irregular periods. The most distinctive symptom was their complexion, a strange greenish or yellowish tint to the skin that gave them an otherworldly, sickly appearance. Imagine seeing your daughter's skin take on this eerie hue, with no obvious explanation, no injury, no clear cause. Physicians of the era were baffled. They conducted examinations, observed patients carefully, and developed elaborate theories. The most prominent explanation involved our old friends, the humours. Doctors theorized that chlorosis resulted from an imbalance in the blood itself. Young women's blood, they argued, was somehow immature, thin, or watery. This deficient blood could not properly nourish the body, leading to the pallor, the weakness, the emotional disturbances. They called it blood poverty or bloodlessness, suggesting that chlorotic girls were somehow lacking in their vital essence. But Victorian physicians took this much further. They were not content with simple physical explanations. They needed to understand why this disease seemed to target young women specifically, and why it so often accompanied emotional and behavioral changes. The answer they settled on was deeply revealing of their attitudes toward female development. Chlorosis, they decided, was fundamentally a disease of sexual maturity, or rather, the lack thereof. The theory went like this. Young women were designed by nature to menstruate regularly, marry, have sexual relations, and bear children. This was their biological destiny, their purpose. When a young woman failed to follow this natural progression, when her periods were irregular, when she remained unmarried past the proper age, when she had not yet engaged in sexual activity, her body would rebel. The unexpressed reproductive energy would essentially poison her system, manifesting as chlorosis. She was literally turning green from unfulfilled biological purpose. One prominent physician, Thomas Laycock, wrote in the mid-1800s about what he called insufficient vitality in chlorotic girls. He linked the condition not just to irregular menstruation, but to emotional repression and sexual frustration. Charles Murchison, another influential Victorian doctor, echoed these views, arguing that the disease stemmed from an imbalance caused by diet. Yes, but more fundamentally by the thwarting of natural feminine instincts. A Victorian medical text from the period states quite plainly, "She pines, she fades," as if the young woman were a flower denied water and sun. Think about what this diagnosis meant for a young woman and her family. Your daughter is 15, perhaps 16. She seems listless, uninterested in food, pale and tired. Her skin has taken on that strange tint. She cries easily, seems melancholy, speaks of feeling worthless or purposeless. You call the doctor, he examines her and delivers his verdict. Chlorosis. And the cure? Marriage. The sooner the better. Sexual relations and pregnancy will restore her blood to proper vitality, balance her humours, cure her green pallor and dark moods. Your daughter does not need understanding or patience or time to mature emotionally. She needs a husband. Can you imagine being that girl? You're going through puberty, experiencing all the physical and emotional changes that come with adolescence. Your body is transforming in ways that might be frightening or confusing. Your moods swing unpredictably. You feel sad sometimes, anxious other times for reasons you cannot always articulate. And instead of being told this is normal, instead of being given time and support, you are told you have a disease that can only be cured by getting married and having sex. The pressure must have been immense. But the story of chlorosis gets even more interesting when we examine who was being diagnosed with it. Medical records and case studies from the 19th century reveal a striking pattern. Chlorosis was overwhelmingly diagnosed in middle and upper class girls. The daughters of merchants, professionals, landowners, the wealthy, these were the girls turning green. Working class girls, peasant girls, girls who laboured in fields or factories rarely received this diagnosis. Why might that be? The answer lies in lifestyle. Upper-class Victorian girls lived extraordinarily restricted lives. They were kept indoors, away from sunlight and fresh air, because pale skin was considered beautiful, and sun exposure would darken the complexion. They were discouraged from vigorous physical activity because exercise was considered unladylike and potentially dangerous to their reproductive systems. They were dressed in tight corsets and multiple layers of restrictive clothing. They were fed relatively limited diets, often avoiding red meat because hearty appetites were considered unfeminine. They were educated just enough to be accomplished. A bit of music, some drawing, perhaps French, but not so much as to overtax their supposedly delicate brains. In other words, these girls were being systematically deprived of sunlight, exercise, proper nutrition, and intellectual stimulation. Is it any wonder they develop symptoms of illness? Today, we would recognize the greenish pallor, the exhaustion, the shortness of breath, and the heart palpitations as classic signs of iron deficiency anemia. Deprive someone of adequate nutrition, particularly iron-rich foods, keep them indoors away from sunlight, restrict their physical activity, and yes, they will become anemic. Their skin will pale, taking on a yellowish or even greenish tint. They will feel constantly tired. They will experience all the symptoms Victorian physicians attributed to chlorosis. But here is the crucial point. Victorian doctors knew about anemia. They understood that blood could be deficient. They even prescribed treatments that included iron supplements. Yet they insisted on seeing chlorosis as something different, something specific to young women, something tied to their reproductive and emotional development. Why? Because seeing it as simple anemia would require acknowledging that the lifestyle imposed on upper-class girls was making them sick. It would require questioning the entire structure of female education, fashion, and social expectations. Much easier to pathologize the girls themselves. The emotional component of the diagnosis is equally revealing. Victorian physicians consistently noted that chlorotic girls displayed what they called disordered affections. These girls seemed sad, yes, but they also showed other troubling behaviours. Some were described as overly romantic, prone to fantasies and daydreams. Others were noted to be sullen, withdrawn, or irritable. Still others displayed what doctors called hysteric symptoms: emotional outbursts, crying spells, anxiety. One medical text warned that chlorotic girls might develop morbid cravings, including desires for inappropriate foods or, more scandalously, desires that hinted at awakening sexuality. Let us be clear about what was actually happening. Teenage girls were experiencing normal adolescent emotions: the confusion, the mood swings, the emerging sexuality, the questioning of their place in the world. They were feeling constrained by the incredibly limited roles available to them. They were perhaps expressing frustration at their restricted lives, longing for experiences beyond the drawing room, feeling the first stirrings of ambitions that society would never allow them to fulfill. And all of this was pathologized as disease. The treatments prescribed for chlorosis are particularly telling. First and foremost, fresh air and exercise. Suddenly, the very things these girls had been denied as part of proper feminine behavior were now medically necessary. They were told to take walks, to spend time outdoors, to engage in gentle physical activity. Second, a heartier diet, including red meat and iron-rich foods. The very foods they had been taught to avoid as unladylike were now prescribed as medicine. Third, cold baths and tonics meant to stimulate the system. And of course, once the girl reached marriageable age, marriage and pregnancy. Do you see the contradiction? Society created the conditions that made these girls sick, then prescribed as treatment the very things society had forbidden them as part of normal life. It is almost as if the medical establishment understood, at some level, what was really wrong. But rather than changing the social structures that created the problem, they medicalized it, turned it into a female pathology, requiring male medical intervention to cure. There is also something deeply troubling about how chlorosis was used to reinforce Victorian ideas about female nature and proper female roles. Medical textbooks stated explicitly that disease proved women were governed by their reproductive systems. A girl who did not fulfill her biological destiny would sicken and fade. Her very body would rebel against remaining unmarried and childless. This was presented not as social pressure or cultural expectation, but as biological fact. Nature itself demanded that women marry young and bear children. Chlorosis was the proof. Some physicians went so far as to argue that education and intellectual pursuits could cause or worsen chlorosis. The theory was that mental exertion drew blood and vital energy away from the reproductive organs to the brain, disrupting the natural balance. Girls who read too much, who studied too seriously, who showed too much intellectual ambition, were supposedly at higher risk for the disease. One doctor wrote that the cultivation of the mind in young women was unnatural and could lead to impaired vitality and disordered function. In other words, learning makes girls sick. Better to keep them ignorant and focused on their wombs. By the late 19th century, chlorosis was one of the most commonly diagnosed conditions in young women. Medical journals published hundreds of articles about it. Physicians built entire practices around treating it. Pharmaceutical companies sold iron tonics and blood-building elixirs marketed specifically for chlorotic girls. It was a recognized, respectable diagnosis with a substantial medical literature behind it. And then, quite suddenly, it began to disappear. By the 1920s, diagnoses of chlorosis had dropped dramatically. By the 1930s, it had become rare. By the 1950s, medical textbooks no longer included it as a distinct disease. What had changed? Not human biology. Girls still went through puberty, still menstruated, still experienced the same physical processes. What changed was society. As the 20th century progressed, women gained more freedoms. They were allowed more physical activity. Athletic pursuits became acceptable for women. Diets became more varied and nutritious. Fashion loosened literally. Corsets disappeared. Clothing became less restrictive. Women gained access to better education, to careers, to lives beyond early marriage and constant childbearing. And as women's lives expanded, chlorosis vanished. Not because doctors developed better treatments, not because the disease evolved or was eradicated like smallpox. It vanished because it had never really been a distinct disease at all. It was anemia, caused by malnutrition and lifestyle restrictions, combined with the completely normal emotional challenges of adolescence, all packaged together and given a medical name that made it seem like a female-specific pathology. The disappearance of chlorosis is one of the clearest examples in medical history of how diseases can be socially constructed. The symptoms were real. The girls really were anemic, really were suffering. But the framework used to understand those symptoms, the explanations given for them, the meanings assigned to them, those were all shaped by cultural beliefs about women's nature and proper roles. When those cultural beliefs changed, the disease disappeared. Modern medical historians and feminist scholars look back at chlorosis as a cautionary tale. It demonstrates how easily medicine can be used to reinforce social control, how readily genuine suffering can be reinterpreted to support existing power structures, how dangerous it is when medical authority combines with cultural prejudice. The chlorotic girl, pining and fading in her drawing room, was not sick because of her unfulfilled womb. She was sick because society had decided that keeping her pale, weak, ignorant, and confined was more important than keeping her healthy. But even as chlorosis was fading from medical textbooks, physicians were finding new ways to pathologize female emotions and experiences. Because if there is one constant throughout this entire history, it is medicine's persistent need to find something wrong with women. The wandering womb, the imbalanced humours, the demonic possession, the widow's disease, the vapours, the green sickness. Each era found its own way to explain why women seemed emotional, why they suffered, why they did not always fit neatly into the roles society demanded of them. And each explanation served the same purpose: to locate the problem within women's bodies rather than within the society that constrained them. As we move into the 20th century, the explanations would become more sophisticated, wrapped in the language of modern psychology and neuroscience. But scratch the surface and you would find the same old assumptions lurking underneath. And some of the theories developed during this period would prove to be not just absurd, but actively harmful in ways that still echo through women's healthcare today. The story we are about to explore next involves the moon again, because apparently we just cannot leave the moon out of any discussion of female biology, along with some truly wild theories about how menstrual blood could supposedly poison everything from crops to mirrors to men's health. The medieval mind would prove to be endlessly creative when it came to imagining the dangers of female reproduction. If you thought the theories we have explored so far were strange, I need to prepare you for what comes next. Because for thousands of years, across multiple civilizations and cultures, humanity held a belief about menstrual blood that was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. This was not just a medical theory or a religious doctrine. It was a deep cultural conviction that the blood flowing from women's bodies once a month possessed supernatural powers, powers that could wither crops, sour wine, dull mirrors, drive dogs mad, and even kill with a glance. And all of this, physicians and philosophers believed, was controlled by the moon pulling at women's bodies the same way it pulls at the ocean's tides. Let us begin with Pliny the Elder, a Roman author and natural philosopher who lived in the 1st century AD. Pliny wrote an encyclopedic work called Natural History, which was treated as authoritative for over 1,000 years. In it, he dedicated substantial passages to describing the powers of menstrual blood. According to Pliny, a menstruating woman who walked through a field could cause crops to wither and die. If she looked into a mirror, the surface would become clouded and dull. If she touched wine, it would turn sour. Contact with menstrual blood could rust iron, tarnish copper, and cause seeds to become sterile. Dogs who tasted it would go mad and their bite would carry incurable poison. But Pliny also noted something interesting. Menstrual blood could be used for good. A nude menstruating woman walking around a field, he wrote, could protect crops from pests, prevent hailstorms, and even turn away lightning. Her blood could be used in medicines and charms. It was simultaneously the most dangerous and the most powerful substance in nature. The menstruating woman was both threat and protector, poison and cure, all depending on how her power was channeled. Now you might be thinking this was just ancient Roman superstition, long since abandoned by the more enlightened ages. But here is what should genuinely surprise you. These beliefs persisted, almost unchanged, straight through the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. Medieval European physicians, supposedly learned and trained in universities, repeated Pliny's claims in their medical textbooks. They added their own observations and theories, but the fundamental belief remained: menstrual blood was uniquely powerful and uniquely dangerous. The medieval text called The Secrets of Women, which we have mentioned before, devoted extensive passages to the perils of menstrual blood. Written sometime in the late 13th or early 14th century and attributed, probably falsely, to Albertus Magnus, this influential work warned that menstrual blood was more poisonous than that of any venomous creature. It contained, the text claimed, evil humours that could corrupt the air, sicken anyone who came near, and cause all manner of harm. The book was read widely, copied extensively, and shaped European attitudes toward menstruation for centuries. But the medieval period added a twist to these ancient beliefs. They became obsessed with what happened to women who did not menstruate, specifically older women past menopause. If menstruation was the body's way of purging toxic humours, what happened when that purging stopped? The medieval medical answer was genuinely chilling. Those toxic humours, they believed, would accumulate inside the woman's body, growing more concentrated and more poisonous with each passing month. And here is where the story takes a turn into something almost unbelievable. The Secrets of Women states, with apparent seriousness, that postmenopausal women who retained their menstrual blood could poison children simply by looking at them. The text explains, if old women who are no longer menstruating look at children in the cradle, they transmit to them venom through their glance. The evil eye was not metaphorical. It was medical fact caused by retained menstrual blood releasing toxic vapours that rose through the woman's body, concentrated in her eyes, and emanated outward in her gaze. Imagine being an older woman in medieval Europe, perhaps a grandmother, and being told you could not safely look at your own grandchildren because your glance might poison them. Imagine the isolation, the suspicion, the fear this belief must have created. And this was not fringe thinking. This was taught in medical schools, written in authoritative texts, accepted by educated people as scientific truth. Now, let us talk about the moon, because no discussion of menstrual mythology would be complete without it. The connection between menstruation and lunar cycles was noted by virtually every culture that recorded observations about women's bodies. The average menstrual cycle is approximately 29 days. The lunar cycle from new moon to new moon is approximately 29.5 days. To ancient and medieval minds, this could not possibly be coincidence. The moon must be controlling menstruation. Medieval physicians taught that women's bodies, being cold and wet in their humoral nature, were naturally responsive to the moon in ways that hot, dry male bodies were not. Just as the moon pulled the ocean's tides, making waters rise and fall, it pulled at the excess moisture in women's bodies, drawing menstrual blood out at regular intervals. Women were literally described as being in tune with lunar rhythms, their bodies responding to celestial forces beyond their control. This belief had profound implications for how women's emotions were understood. If a woman's body was being pulled and influenced by the moon, then her moods and behaviours would naturally wax and wane with lunar phases. During certain times of the month, she might be calm and rational. During others, especially around menstruation, she would be more emotional, more unstable, more prone to irrational behaviour. Her very temperament was subject to forces as inevitable and impersonal as the tides. Some medieval texts took this even further, suggesting that the position of the moon at the time of a girl's first menstruation would influence her character for life. Born under a full moon, you might have certain traits, new moon, different traits entirely, the moon at conception, at birth, at first menstruation. All of these supposedly shaped a woman's nature in ways that men, free from lunar influence, never experienced. Different cultures developed their own variations on these themes. In ancient Rome, as Pliny described, the menstruating woman had powers both protective and destructive. In medieval Christian Europe, menstruation became more heavily associated with Eve's curse, the punishment for original sin. In some Jewish traditions, menstruating women were considered ritually impure, requiring separation and purification rituals. In Hindu practice, menstruating women were excluded from temples and religious ceremonies. In Islamic tradition, similar restrictions applied. The specific rules varied, but the underlying message was remarkably consistent. Menstruating women were different, dangerous, and needed to be kept separate. But some cultures had radically different perspectives. Among certain Native American tribes, including the Cherokee, menstrual blood was considered sacred and powerful in a positive sense. Cherokee tradition held that menstrual blood could destroy enemies and had genuine spiritual power. Menstruating women were not shunned, but respected for the strength they carried during this time. In ancient Egypt, menstrual blood was sometimes used in healing rituals. Some Aboriginal Australian cultures viewed menstruation as connected to sacred feminine mysteries and spiritual power. The question that should fascinate us is this: why did so many cultures, separated by vast distances and developing independently, create similar myths about menstrual blood? Part of the answer surely lies in simple observation without understanding. People noticed that women bled regularly without being injured and without dying from the blood loss. This seemed miraculous and inexplicable. They noticed that the bleeding coincided roughly with lunar cycles, suggesting cosmic connection. They observed that women often experienced mood changes, physical discomfort, and altered behavior during menstruation. Real phenomena that modern medicine now understands as caused by hormonal fluctuations, but which ancient peoples interpreted as magical or supernatural influence. But there is another dimension to this story, one that is less about observation and more about power. Menstrual taboos and myths served social functions. They provided justification for excluding women from religious ceremonies, political participation, and positions of authority. If menstruating women were impure, poisonous, or under lunar influence that made them irrational, then of course they could not be priests, rulers, or judges. The mythology created a biological basis for social exclusion. Medieval Europe provides clear examples of this dynamic. Canon law, the legal code of the Catholic Church, discouraged menstruating women from entering churches or receiving communion. Medical texts warned that having intercourse with a menstruating woman could result in deformed children, leprosy, or other diseases. A menstruating woman was not supposed to bake bread because she might ruin the dough. She should not touch wine barrels or milk cattle. She should not garden or handle food. Each restriction narrowed her world, limited her activities, reinforced her difference and supposed danger. And yet, as with so many of the theories we have explored, there were always dissenters. Some medieval physicians questioned whether menstrual blood was really so dangerous. Some pointed out that plenty of women baked bread, tended gardens, and handled food while menstruating, with no ill effects. Some argued that the restrictions were based more on superstition than observation. But these skeptical voices were typically drowned out by the weight of tradition and authority. One particularly fascinating aspect of menstrual mythology involves the relationship between menstruation and magical power. Throughout European folk tradition and into the witch trial period, menstrual blood featured prominently in accusations of witchcraft. Witches supposedly used menstrual blood in spells and potions. They brewed it into love potions or poisonous concoctions. They used it to bind men to their will or curse their enemies. The Malleus Maleficarum, that handbook for witch hunters we discussed earlier, includes passages warning about the dangerous ways witches might employ menstrual blood. But think about what this really meant. Women's own bodies, producing a natural biological fluid, were being characterized as inherently connected to evil magic. The monthly process that half the population experienced was being framed as something sinister, something that could be weaponized by those with malicious intent. This created a climate of fear and suspicion around something completely normal and unavoidable. The psychological impact of growing up with these beliefs must have been profound. Imagine being a young girl in medieval or early modern Europe, experiencing your first period. This confusing, perhaps frightening event is accompanied by messages that you are now impure, dangerous, capable of causing harm with your mere presence. You must hide this evidence of your maturation, feel shame about your body's natural functions, worry constantly about contaminating others or revealing your state. The blood that flows from you is characterized as poisonous, evil-laden, supernaturally powerful in malevolent ways. How do you develop a healthy relationship with your own body under such conditions? As the Enlightenment progressed and scientific understanding of biology advanced, many of these specific beliefs about menstrual blood's magical properties began to fade. By the 18th and 19th centuries, educated physicians no longer seriously claimed that menstruating women could sour wine with a glance, or that postmenopausal women poisoned children with their eyes. The supernatural elements dropped away as anatomy and physiology became better understood. But the underlying attitudes, that menstruation was shameful, that menstruating women were somehow impure or compromised, that women's reproductive functions made them fundamentally different and lesser, those attitudes proved far more durable. They simply took on new forms. Victorian society might not have believed menstrual blood could wither crops, but it certainly believed that menstruating women should hide all evidence of their condition, speak of it only in euphemisms if at all, and restrict their activities during their periods. Even today, studies show that menstrual taboos persist worldwide. In some countries, girls still miss school during their periods due to lack of sanitary supplies or bathroom facilities. In others, menstruating women face restrictions on entering temples, preparing food, or participating in certain activities. The specific beliefs may have evolved, but the fundamental discomfort with female biology remains remarkably persistent. The legacy of menstrual mythology also appears in more subtle ways. Consider how many euphemisms exist for menstruation. Dozens upon dozens in every language, because apparently we cannot just say the word. Consider how menstrual products are still marketed with blue liquid instead of anything resembling blood, as if the actual substance is too disturbing to acknowledge. Consider how women still report hiding tampons in their sleeves on the way to the bathroom, as if being seen with menstrual supplies would be shameful. These are echoes of thousands of years of messaging that menstruation is something to conceal, something slightly dangerous, something not quite proper. The moon connection too persists in modern culture, though usually in more benign forms. People still talk about moon cycles and female synchrony, the idea that women who live together will synchronize their menstrual cycles. Despite the fact that large-scale studies have found no evidence for this synchronization, the belief remains popular because it fits our culturally inherited narrative about women, menstruation, and lunar influence. What this entire history reveals is how difficult it is for humanity to simply accept female biology as normal, unremarkable, and not in need of elaborate mythological explanation. For thousands of years, instead of understanding menstruation as a routine physiological process, cultures created elaborate stories about supernatural powers, lunar control, toxic humors, and divine punishment. These stories serve to mark women as other, as fundamentally different from the male standard, as requiring special rules and restrictions. The mythology of menstrual blood was never just about blood. It was about creating and maintaining boundaries, about justifying women's exclusion from full participation in society, about transforming a biological process into evidence of female inferiority or danger. As we have moved through this journey from wandering wombs to demonic possession, to sexual theories, to Victorian vapours, to green sickness, to menstrual mythology, a pattern has emerged. Every era finds its own way to pathologise female experience, to locate problems within women's bodies rather than within society's structures, to explain emotional responses as biological dysfunction, rather than as reasonable reactions to difficult circumstances. The vocabulary changes, humours become vapours, become hormones, but the underlying impulse remains the same, and that impulse was about to encounter something new. Because as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, a revolution was brewing in how the human mind itself was understood. Psychology was emerging as a distinct field of study. The unconscious mind was being theorized, and one man in particular was about to take all the old prejudices about female nature, dress them up in the sophisticated language of psychoanalysis, and create theories that would influence psychology for the next century. His name was Sigmund Freud, and his ideas about women's emotions were about to make everything we have discussed so far seem almost quaint by comparison. Because Freud had a theory about what was really wrong with women, and it involved something called penis envy. Vienna, 1896. A young neurologist named Sigmund Freud stood before his colleagues at the Society for Psychiatry and Neurology and presented a paper that would shock the medical establishment. He'd been treating women suffering from what was then called hysteria, and he had discovered something disturbing. Many of his patients, he reported, had been sexually abused as children, often by male relatives or authority figures. Freud proposed that this childhood sexual trauma was the root cause of their adult psychological suffering. He called it the seduction theory, and for a brief moment it seemed Freud was on the verge of exposing a dark truth about the prevalence of child sexual abuse and its devastating psychological consequences. But then something remarkable happened. Within a year, Freud abandoned this theory completely. He decided that his patients had not been telling him about real abuse. They had been, he now claimed, describing fantasies. And the reason for these fantasies? an unconscious sexual desire for their own fathers. Welcome to the world of Freudian psychoanalysis, where the explanation for female emotions would become stranger, more elaborate, and more influential than anything that had come before. Sigmund Freud, born in 1856, would become perhaps the most famous psychologist in history. His theories about the unconscious mind, dream interpretation, and psychological development shaped not just medicine but literature, art, popular culture, and the way Western society understands the human psyche. His influence is impossible to overstate, and yet, when it comes to his theories about women, even his most devoted followers have had to admit that Freud got almost everything spectacularly, bewilderingly wrong. Let us start with a theory that would become infamous: penis envy. Freud theorized that psychological development in early childhood was fundamentally shaped by sexuality. Boys and girls, he argued, progressed through specific stages of psychosexual development. Everything was going along similarly for both sexes until they reached what Freud called the phallic stage, around ages 3 to 6. This is when children supposedly became aware of anatomical differences between males and females, and this awareness, Freud believed, created a profound psychological crisis, but only for girls. According to Freud, when a little girl discovered that boys had penises and she did not, she would experience this as a devastating realization of lack, of deficiency, of being incomplete. She would blame her mother for this perceived mutilation. She would develop what Freud termed penis envy, a deep unconscious sense of inferiority and longing for the male organ she did not possess. This penis envy, Freud taught, would shape her entire psychological development. It would influence her relationships, her ambitions, her personality, her very sense of self. Every woman in Freud's framework was fundamentally defined by the absence of a penis and her unconscious desire to possess one. Now, before you start laughing, and you probably should, let me emphasize that Freud was deadly serious about this theory, and so were his followers. This was not presented as metaphor or symbolic thinking. Freud genuinely believed that women's psychological development was shaped by literally envying male anatomy. He wrote extensively about how penis envy manifested in adult women's lives. A woman's desire for achievement, that was really displaced penis envy, her attempt to compensate for her anatomical lack. A woman's ambition or competitiveness, masculine protest, a denial of her essential femininity driven by that same envy. A woman who wanted children. Finally, a healthy resolution because according to Freud, a baby, especially a male baby, could symbolically substitute for the penis she unconsciously craved. Let that sink in for a moment. Freud took the entire range of human female experience, ambition, creativity, motherhood, relationships, work, identity, and reduced it all to women's supposed psychological response to not having male genitalia. Can you imagine being a woman in Freud's time, going to him for help with depression or anxiety or trauma, and being told that your real problem was that you unconsciously wished you had a penis? The audacity is almost impressive in its scope. But penis envy was just one piece of Freud's larger theory about female psychology. He also developed an elaborate framework around what he called the Oedipus complex in girls, though he later called it the Electra complex, borrowing from Greek mythology. According to this theory, young girls naturally developed sexual desires for their fathers, and saw their mothers as rivals for paternal affection. This was supposedly a normal and universal stage of development. When the girl realized she could not possess her father, she would ideally transfer these feelings onto other men, eventually marrying and having children. Now, here is where Freud's early work on childhood sexual abuse becomes deeply troubling. Remember how I mentioned that Freud initially believed his patients who reported childhood sexual abuse? When he abandoned that theory and decided they were describing fantasies rather than real events, He used the Oedipus complex to explain those fantasies. The women were not remembering abuse, he argued. They were projecting their own childhood sexual desires onto their fathers and other male relatives. In other words, Freud took women's accounts of sexual trauma and reframed them as evidence of the women's own inappropriate desires. The implications of this reversal were devastating. Freud had briefly opened a door to acknowledging the reality and prevalence of child sexual abuse. Then he slammed that door shut and blamed the victims. His influence was so enormous that this perspective dominated psychology for decades. Women who sought therapy for trauma were often told they were misremembering, fantasizing, or unconsciously expressing their own repressed desires. The actual abuse they had endured was dismissed as psychological fiction. Why did Freud make this reversal? Historians and scholars have debated this question extensively. Some suggest he faced a professional pressure. Acknowledging widespread child abuse among respectable Viennese families would have been extremely controversial. Others point to Freud's own psychological complexities and his difficult relationship with his father. Still others argue that Freud simply found his new theories more intellectually compelling, even if they required disbelieving his patients. Whatever the reason, the consequences were profound and long-lasting. Freud's theories about women extended beyond penis envy and the Oedipus complex. He developed a framework for understanding female sexuality that was equally problematic. He distinguished between what he called clitoral orgasms and vaginal orgasms, arguing that mature, psychologically healthy women should experience only vaginal orgasms. Clitoral stimulation, he suggested, was immature, a holdover from childhood sexuality. A woman who could only achieve orgasm through clitoral stimulation was, in Freud's view, psychologically underdeveloped, still stuck in that early stage where she was trying to use her clitoris as the substitute penis. This theory caused immeasurable harm to countless women. For decades, women who could not achieve orgasm through penetration alone, which we now know is the majority of women, were told they were psychologically damaged. They sought treatment for being frigid, underwent therapy to address their supposed neuroses, and were made to feel inadequate and broken because their bodies did not respond according to Freud's made-up developmental stages. The fact that Freud's theory had no basis in anatomy or physiology did not matter. He was Freud. His word was treated as gospel. Freud also had distinctive views on female emotional life more generally. He characterized women as more narcissistic than men, more vain, more concerned with being loved than with loving others. He suggested that women had weaker superegos, his term for the internalized moral conscience, because they had not fully resolved their Oedipus complexes the way boys did through castration anxiety. Women, in Freud's framework, were less capable of true ethical development, less able to form abstract moral principles. They remained more focused on personal relationships and approval than on universal moral laws. He described women as having less capacity for sublimation, the process of channeling base drives into culturally productive activities. This supposedly explained why there were fewer great female artists, scientists, and philosophers, not because women had been denied education, resources, and opportunities for thousands of years. No, it was because their penis envy prevented them from successfully sublimating their drives into creative achievement. When women did achieve great things, Freud and his followers often characterized them as masculine, as women who had never properly accepted their femininity. Now, to be fair to Freud, and there is not much fairness due here, but we should try, he was a product of his time and culture. He lived in late Victorian and early 20th century Vienna, a deeply patriarchal society with rigid gender roles. Many of his patients were upper-class women whose lives were severely restricted, who had few outlets for their intelligence and creativity, who were indeed suffering from the constraints placed upon them. Freud observed genuine suffering. But instead of questioning whether the social structure might be the problem, he developed elaborate theories locating the dysfunction within women's psyches. There is also some evidence that Freud himself was uncomfortable with some of his own conclusions about women. He famously wrote late in his career, "The great question that has never been answered, and which I have not yet been able to answer, despite my 30 years of research into the feminine soul, is, what does a woman want?" This statement reveals something important. After 3 decades of studying women's psychology, developing elaborate theories about female development and sexuality, treating countless female patients, Freud admitted he still did not understand women, and yet he never considered that perhaps his entire theoretical framework was flawed from the beginning. The influence of Freudian theory on 20th century culture cannot be overstated. Psychoanalysis became wildly popular, not just in medical circles but in broader intellectual culture. Artists, writers, and thinkers embraced Freudian concepts. The idea that human behavior was driven by unconscious sexual desires and childhood experiences became common knowledge. Terms like repression, projection, and Oedipus complex entered everyday language. And all of Freud's theories about women, the penis envy, the inferior moral development, the immature sexuality, were absorbed into mainstream thinking about female nature. This had real consequences for real women. Women seeking psychological help were often subjected to Freudian analysis that blamed them for their suffering. Women who had been abused were told they had fantasized it. Women who were unhappy in traditional roles were diagnosed with neuroses rather than having their dissatisfaction validated. Women who did not fit feminine ideals were pathologized. The entire framework reinforced existing gender hierarchies by giving them psychological and scientific legitimacy. Other psychoanalysts in Freud's circle sometimes challenged his views on women. Karen Horney, one of the first female psychoanalysts, argued forcefully against penis envy, suggesting that men might actually experience womb envy of women's capacity to create life. She proposed that male cultural dominance and the devaluation of women stemmed from men's unconscious need to compensate for this fundamental creative capacity that they lacked. Horney's theories never gained the traction that Freud's did, in part because the psychoanalytic establishment was dominated by men who found Freud's framework more congenial. Melanie Klein, another pioneering female psychoanalyst, developed theories focusing on early mother-infant relationships that diverged significantly from Freud's father-centered model. She emphasized the importance of maternal bonds and suggested that psychological development was more complex and less genitally focused than Freud proposed. But again, Klein's work was often sidelined or incorporated into Freudian orthodoxy rather than replacing it. The dominance of Freudian theory in psychology and psychiatry began to wane in the latter half of the 20th century. Advances in neuroscience, the development of cognitive and behavioral therapies, and the rise of feminist critique all contributed to exposing the limitations and biases in Freud's work. The American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which defines mental disorders for diagnostic purposes, gradually moved away from psychoanalytic frameworks towards symptom-based classifications. But even as professional psychology moved on from Freud, his ideas retained significant cultural influence. The notion that women are fundamentally motivated by envy of male power, that female ambition is somehow compensatory, that women's psychology is more mysterious and complex than men's. These Freudian echoes persist in subtle ways in how society thinks about gender. The therapeutic relationship itself, the idea of talking through problems with a trained professional, owes much to Freud's innovations, even if his specific theories have been largely discredited. What this chapter of history reveals is how easily scientific authority can be used to dress up cultural prejudice in respectable language. Freud took the same basic assumptions about female inferiority that had existed for thousands of years, that women were incomplete, deficient, emotionally unstable, less capable of higher thought, and gave them psychological terminology and theoretical frameworks. The content barely changed, just the vocabulary. Women were no longer suffering from wandering wombs, or humoral imbalances, or demonic possession, or sexual deprivation. Now they were suffering from penis envy, unresolved Oedipal conflicts, and immature psychosexual development. Modern psychology has largely rejected Freud's specific theories about women. No reputable therapist today would diagnose a woman with penis envy or tell her that her clitoral orgasms indicate psychological immaturity. Contemporary psychology recognizes the harm done by decades of Freudian-influenced treatment that blamed women for their trauma and pathologized normal female experience. There is growing awareness of how psychological theory has historically been shaped by the gender biases of its predominantly male creators. Yet the fundamental challenge remains. How do we understand and treat women's emotional and psychological suffering without locating the problem solely within women themselves? How do we acknowledge that living in a sexist society might cause genuine psychological distress, without dismissing all female complaints as political rather than personal? How do we develop psychological theories and treatments that account for both individual psychology and social context? These questions, which Freud and his predecessors failed to grapple with honestly, are still being worked out in contemporary psychology and psychiatry. As we've journeyed from ancient Egypt to Freudian Vienna, we have seen a remarkable consistency in how medicine and society have approached female emotions. The theories have varied wildly: wandering wombs, toxic humors, demonic forces, sexual frustration, nervous weakness, green blood, poisonous menstruation, penis envy, but the underlying message has remained eerily similar. There is something fundamentally wrong with women. Their emotions are excessive, unreliable, pathological, their bodies work against them. Their nature makes them unsuited for full participation in society. The problem is always located within women, never within the structures that constrain them. But there is one more chapter in this story that we need to explore, and it involves some of the most shocking medical treatments ever devised. Because as psychology was developing its theories about the female mind, gynecology was developing its own interventions for female disorders, and some of those interventions involved surgical removal of healthy organs, ovaries, uteruses, even clitorises, in attempts to cure everything from depression to rebelliousness to simple unhappiness. The medical establishment, convinced that female emotions stemmed from female reproductive organs, decided that sometimes the solution was to simply remove those organs entirely. That disturbing history is where we head next, into an era when women's bodies were treated as problems to be solved through increasingly radical surgical solutions. What I am about to share with you is perhaps the darkest chapter in the history of medicine's approach to female emotions. It involves surgery, not to save lives, not to remove tumours or repair injuries, but to cure sadness, anxiety, and what physicians called unnatural behaviour. Between the 1860s and the early 1900s, tens of thousands of women underwent surgical removal of healthy reproductive organs in attempts to treat everything from depression to rebelliousness to simple unhappiness. Ovaries were removed, uteruses were extracted, and in some truly shocking cases, clitorises were surgically excised. All of this was done by respected physicians in major hospitals and presented as cutting-edge medical treatment. This is the story of how medicine took the ancient belief that female emotions originated in reproductive organs and pushed it to its most extreme, most brutal conclusion. The practice that would become most widespread was called oophorectomy, the surgical removal of ovaries. To understand how this became accepted medical practice, we need to meet the man who pioneered it, Robert Batty, an American gynecologist practicing in Georgia. In 1872, Batty performed what he called normal oophorectomy, the removal of healthy, non-diseased ovaries on a woman suffering from what he described as severe nervous and mental disturbances. The surgery, Batty claimed, was a remarkable success. The woman's symptoms improved, her emotional state stabilized. She was, in his assessment, cured. Batty published his results, and the medical community took notice. Here was a concrete intervention, a surgical solution to the problem of female hysteria and emotional instability. If women's reproductive organs cause their psychological suffering, why not simply remove those organs? The logic seemed impeccable to 19th century physicians who had spent centuries blaming every female complaint on the uterus and ovaries. The operation became known as Batty's operation and spread rapidly across America and Europe. The procedure was performed on women experiencing an astonishingly broad range of symptoms: depression, oophorectomy; anxiety, oophorectomy; insomnia, oophorectomy; irritability, restlessness, erratic behavior, anything that physicians deemed hysterical or nervous. All were considered potential indications for surgery. Some women were subjected to the operation for exhibiting sexual desire that physicians considered excessive. Others underwent it for showing insufficient sexual interest in their husbands. The criteria were vague, subjective, and entirely at the discretion of male physicians. By the 1890s, it is estimated that thousands of these operations were being performed annually in the United States alone. The exact numbers are difficult to establish because record-keeping was inconsistent, but medical historians suggest that between 9,000 and 15,000 women underwent oophorectomy for psychiatric or behavioral reasons during the peak years of the practice. Think about that for a moment. Thousands of women having their healthy reproductive organs surgically removed, sterilized without the possibility of reversal, subjected to major surgery with all its attendant risks, infection, hemorrhage, surgical complications, all in the name of treating emotional distress. The medical rationale was dressed in scientific language, but it was fundamentally based on the same old assumptions we have encountered throughout this journey. Physicians theorized that the ovaries exerted powerful influence over the female nervous system through some kind of mysterious connection. They spoke of reflex irritation, the idea that diseased or overactive ovaries sent harmful signals through the nerves to the brain, causing psychological symptoms. Remove the ovaries and you sever that harmful connection, allowing the nervous system to stabilize. It sounded plausible to 19th century ears, even though there was no evidence for this supposed neural pathway and no understanding of how it might actually work. What made this particularly insidious was the power dynamic involved. Women seeking help for genuine suffering, depression that might result from restrictive lives, anxiety from difficult marriages, exhaustion from endless childbearing and domestic labor, would consult male physicians who held all the authority. The physician would determine that her reproductive organs were the problem. He would recommend surgery. The woman, taught to defer to medical expertise, often had little choice but to consent. Her husband's consent was usually required as well, and husbands often agreed, especially if the physician framed it as a cure for troublesome behavior. Some women did report feeling better after the surgery, but modern medical historians point out several factors that might explain this beyond the surgery itself. The recovery period required weeks or months of rest, often in a sanitarium or hospital setting away from domestic demands and family pressures. For women exhausted by constant childbearing and housework, this enforced rest might have been genuinely therapeutic. The attention and care they received, the sense that something was finally being done to address their suffering, the placebo effect, all of these could contribute to subjective improvement. And of course, the surgery-induced surgical menopause, which altered hormone levels and might have affected mood, though not necessarily in beneficial ways. But many women did not improve. They experienced all the side effects of sudden menopause, hot flashes, mood swings, bone density loss, cardiovascular problems, while still struggling with the psychological issues that had led to surgery in the first place. Because, of course, removing ovaries does not cure depression that stems from an unhappy marriage or anxiety that results from lack of autonomy or grief from losing children to disease, the surgery addressed a supposed biological cause while ignoring all the social, economic, and personal circumstances that actually shape these women's emotional lives. Now brace yourself, because the story gets darker. Enter Isaac Baker Brown, a prominent British gynecological surgeon and president of the Medical Society of London. In the 1860s, Brown became convinced that he had discovered the root cause of female hysteria, epilepsy, and what he called mania, masturbation. Specifically, he believed that clitoral stimulation was causing these conditions, and so Brown began performing a procedure he called clitoridectomy, surgical removal of the clitoris, as a cure for these supposed ailments. Brown published a book in 1896 titled On the Curability of Certain Forms of Insanity, Epilepsy, Catalepsy, and Hysteria in Females, in which he detailed his surgical technique and reported on numerous cases. He described women and girls, some as young as 10 years old, whom he had operated on. According to Brown, the surgery was remarkably effective. Women who had been difficult and melancholic or rebellious became calm and manageable after clitoridectomy. Girls who masturbated stopped the behavior. Women with seizures or psychological disturbances improved. The medical community's response to Brown was mixed, but not for the reasons you might hope. Some physicians objected, but primarily on grounds that Brown had performed the operations without obtaining proper consent from patients or their families. Others questioned whether the surgery was truly effective or whether it was too extreme, but many physicians found the underlying logic compelling. If female sexual sensation was causing psychological problems, and Victorian medicine was deeply concerned about female sexuality, then removing the source of that sensation seemed reasonable. Brown's career eventually ended in disgrace, not because of the surgeries themselves, but because of the consent issues, and because he had publicized his work too aggressively, which his colleagues felt was ungentlemanly and commercialistic. He was expelled from the Obstetrical Society of London in 1867, but the practice of clitoridectomy did not end with Brown's downfall. Other physicians continued performing the surgery, though usually more quietly and without Brown's level of publicity. In the United States, clitoridectomy was performed sporadically into the early 20th century. It was never as common as oophorectomy, but it happened often enough that medical journals published articles discussing technique and outcomes. The operation was presented as a treatment for persistent masturbation, nymphomania, defined as excessive sexual desire, and various nervous conditions supposedly related to clitoral irritation. Some physicians even recommended it for young girls to prevent them from developing the habit of masturbation. Let me be very clear about what this means. Medical professionals, people who had taken oaths to do no harm, were surgically mutilating women and girls, removing a part of their anatomy that served no purpose other than providing sexual pleasure, because they believed female sexuality itself was pathological. They were using surgery to control women's bodies, women's sexuality, and women's behavior. The cruelty of this, the violation, the lifelong impact on these women's physical and emotional well-being it is difficult to overstate. The question we must ask is, how did this happen? How did respected medical professionals, educated men, come to believe that cutting off parts of women's bodies was appropriate treatment for emotional distress? The answer lies in the convergence of several factors. First, surgery was becoming increasingly safe due to advances in anesthesia and antiseptic technique. Operations that would have been death sentences in earlier eras could now be performed with reasonable survival rates. This made surgery seem like a viable option for conditions that had previously been untreatable. Second, gynecology was establishing itself as a distinct medical specialty, and ambitious gynecologists were looking for conditions they could treat surgically. Surgery was dramatic, definitive, and allowed physicians to demonstrate skill and achieve measurable results. It also generated substantial fees. There was, frankly, a financial incentive to find surgical solutions to medical problems. Third, and perhaps most importantly, these surgeries fit perfectly with existing beliefs about female nature. If women were governed by their reproductive organs, if their emotions stemmed from their wombs and ovaries, if their sexuality was dangerous and needed to be controlled, then surgical intervention made sense within that framework. The surgeries were logical extensions of theories that had been accepted for thousands of years. Consider the social control aspect as well. Women who underwent oophorectomy could no longer bear children. Women who underwent clitoridectomy had their sexual pleasure significantly diminished or eliminated. These were not side effects. In many cases, they were features. A woman whose ovaries had been removed could not get pregnant, which might be convenient for a husband tired of supporting children or a family concerned about hereditary illness. A woman whose clitoris had been removed might be less interested in sex, which Victorian morality held as appropriate for respectable women anyway. The surgeries could serve to make women more manageable, more compliant, more aligned with social expectations. The practice of performing these surgeries for psychiatric indications began to decline in the early 20th century, though it did not disappear entirely until mid-century. Several factors contributed to the decline. The surgeries often did not produce the promised results, and physicians began to notice this. The development of psychotherapy and other psychiatric treatments provided alternatives. The feminist movement and women's increasing access to education and professional careers meant more women questioning medical authority, and gradually advancing understanding of endocrinology and neurology revealed that the supposed connections between ovaries and mental states were far more complex than the simple reflex irritation theory suggested. But the legacy of this era persists. It demonstrates how easily medicine can be weaponized to enforce social norms, particularly around gender. It shows how scientific language and medical authority can be used to justify practices that are fundamentally about control rather than care. It reveals the dangers of locating social problems within individual bodies and seeking biological solutions to what are often social, economic, or political issues. Today we recognize these practices as medical abuse. No modern physician would remove healthy ovaries or perform clitoridectomy to treat depression or anxiety. We understand that such surgeries were violations of bodily autonomy, often performed without genuine informed consent, and based on flawed theories about female nature. Medical ethics now emphasizes patient autonomy, informed consent, and the principle of not performing interventions that cause more harm than good. Yet we should not be too quick to congratulate ourselves on how far we have come. Medical treatment of women still faces challenges around being heard, believed, and treated appropriately. Women's pain is still sometimes dismissed as psychological when it is physical, or as exaggerated when it is real. Women still report feeling that their complaints are not taken as seriously as men's. The specific practices have changed, But some of the underlying attitudes, that women are more emotional, more prone to psychological issues, harder to treat, more mysterious, those attitudes linger in subtle ways. This history also raises important questions about medical innovation and ethics. When is a new surgical procedure justified? How do we ensure that treatments are developed based on sound evidence rather than cultural prejudice? How do we protect vulnerable populations from being subjects of medical experimentation? These questions remain relevant today as new treatments and interventions are developed. The women who underwent these surgeries deserve to be remembered. They were not simply victims of backward medical practices. They were individuals seeking help for real suffering, trusting in medical expertise, and often having their bodies permanently altered in ways that did not address their actual needs. Their stories are part of medical history, a reminder of what can happen when medicine operates without adequate ethical constraints, and when treatment is shaped more by social control than by genuine care. As we approach the end of this long journey through the history of explaining female emotions, we can see a clear pattern. From ancient Egypt to Victorian operating rooms, society has consistently sought to explain women's emotional lives through their bodies, specifically their reproductive organs. The explanations have varied: wandering wombs, humoral imbalances, demonic forces, sexual frustration, nervous disorders, reproductive organ disease, but the impulse has remained constant. Locate the problem in women's biology. Treat it with interventions ranging from scented oils to surgical mutilation. Maintain the fiction that the problem is medical rather than social, but this story does have a resolution, though perhaps not a complete one. By the mid-20th century, the medical profession was finally beginning to let go of some of these ideas. Hysteria was on its way out as a diagnosis. The understanding of human psychology and physiology was advancing, and crucially, women themselves were gaining more voice, more power, more ability to push back against medical theories that pathologized their very existence. The final chapters of this story involve the disappearance of hysteria as a medical category and what that disappearance reveals about how diseases can be as much social constructs as biological realities. And that is exactly where we turn next, to understand how a diagnosis that had persisted for thousands of years simply vanished in the course of a few decades, and what that tells us about everything we have discussed. Something extraordinary happened in 1980, though you might not have noticed it at the time. The American Psychiatric Association published a new edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, the authoritative reference book that defines what counts as a mental illness in the United States and much of the world. And in this new edition, a diagnosis that had existed for nearly 4,000 years simply vanished. Hysteria. That catch-all explanation for female emotional distress that we have traced from ancient Egypt through Victorian operating rooms was gone, removed, erased from official medical nomenclature. A disease that had been diagnosed millions of times, written about in thousands of medical texts, used to justify everything from scented oils to surgical mutilation, had ceased to exist. How does a disease that old, that established, that fundamental to medical thinking just disappear? The answer tells us something profound about the nature of illness itself, and about how much of what we call disease is actually shaped by culture, power, and social expectation. The decline of hysteria as a diagnosis did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process that unfolded across the 20th century, accelerating after World War II and culminating in that 1980 decision. To understand why hysteria disappeared, we need to look at several converging factors that fundamentally challenge the diagnosis and what it represented. The first major blow came from an unexpected source: war. During World War I, military doctors encountered something that deeply troubled them. Soldiers, male soldiers, were developing symptoms identical to those that had been attributed to female hysteria for thousands of years. These men experienced paralysis with no physical cause, blindness with no damage to their eyes, tremors, amnesia, emotional outbursts, the inability to speak. They had been in combat, witnessed horrors, lost comrades, and their minds and bodies were responding in ways that the medical establishment had always characterized as feminine weakness. Initially, doctors struggled with how to classify these symptoms. Some tried to maintain the hysteria diagnosis, awkwardly referring to male hysteria or soldiers' hysteria, but this created obvious problems. If hysteria was fundamentally linked to the uterus, to female reproductive organs, to women's inherently weaker nervous constitution, how could men develop the same condition? The cognitive dissonance was impossible to ignore. British physician Arthur Frederick Hurst wrote in 1919 that he had observed many cases of gross hysterical symptoms in soldiers who had no family or personal history of neuroses and who were perfectly fit before the war. These were not weak feminine men. They were ordinary soldiers who had endured extraordinary trauma. The solution was to create a new diagnostic category: shell shock, later called battle fatigue, combat neurosis, and eventually post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. This new framework recognized that severe psychological trauma could produce physical and emotional symptoms in anyone, regardless of gender. It acknowledged that the human nervous system had limits, and that overwhelming experiences could break even strong, healthy individuals. This was a radical shift from the hysteria framework, which had always located the problem in the inherent weakness of female biology. The recognition of combat trauma in men made it increasingly difficult to maintain that similar symptoms in women resulted from wandering wombs or reproductive organ dysfunction. If a soldier could develop paralysis from witnessing battle, might a woman develop similar symptoms from different but equally overwhelming experiences? Might her symptoms be responses to trauma, stress, or impossible life circumstances, rather than manifestations of inherent female pathology? These questions began to chip away at the foundations of the hysteria diagnosis. The second major factor was the advancement of medical knowledge, particularly in neurology and endocrinology. As doctors gained better understanding of how the nervous system actually worked, of how hormones influenced mood and behavior, of what brain injuries and neurological conditions actually looked like, many symptoms previously attributed to hysteria could be reclassified as genuine medical conditions. A woman experiencing seizures might have epilepsy, a real neurological disorder. A woman with paralysis might have multiple sclerosis, or a conversion disorder related to psychological trauma. A woman with mood swings might have what we now call bipolar disorder, or might be experiencing hormonal fluctuations related to thyroid function. The development of new diagnostic techniques, X-rays, EEGs to measure brain activity, blood tests to measure hormone levels, gave physicians tools to identify physical causes for symptoms. Many women who would have been diagnosed with hysteria in earlier eras could now receive more accurate diagnoses. The hysteria category, which had functioned as a dumping ground for any symptom doctors could not otherwise explain, was no longer necessary. If you could not explain a symptom, you could at least run tests to rule out specific conditions rather than defaulting to a vague diagnosis of hysteria. The third crucial factor was the women's liberation movement. By the 1960s and 70s, feminist activists and scholars were critically examining how medicine had historically treated women. They analysed the hysteria diagnosis and exposed it for what it was: a tool of social control dressed in medical language. Feminist writers pointed out that symptoms labelled as hysteria often appeared in women whose life circumstances would make anyone distressed. Women in abusive marriages, women denied education and opportunities, women exhausted by endless childbearing, women trapped in suffocatingly limited roles. The feminist critique asked uncomfortable questions. Why were women who expressed anger or ambition labelled as sick? Why were emotional responses to genuinely difficult circumstances pathologized rather than validated? Why did the medical establishment consistently locate problems within women's bodies rather than within the social structures that constrained them? These questions could not be easily dismissed, especially as more women entered medicine and psychology as professionals and brought their own perspectives to bear. One particularly influential moment came in 1970 when two researchers, Colin P. McEvedy and A.W. Beard, published a paper analysing an outbreak of illness at the Royal Free Hospital in London in 1955. More than 300 staff members, predominantly young women, had fallen ill with symptoms including muscle pain, exhaustion, mood changes, and various physical complaints. The illness had been mysterious and debilitating. McEvedy and Beard, writing 15 years later, concluded it had been an epidemic of mass hysteria. The feminist response was swift and fierce. How dare male researchers dismiss the real suffering of hundreds of women as hysteria? The condition, now recognized as myalgic encephalomyelitis, or chronic fatigue syndrome, was a genuine neurological illness, not hysteria. The controversy highlighted how the hysteria label continued to be used to dismiss and delegitimize women's experiences of illness. The fourth factor was the development of new psychiatric frameworks that moved away from psychoanalytic models towards symptom-based classification. The DSM itself underwent major revisions in the 1960s and 1970s, attempting to create more reliable, objective diagnostic criteria. Instead of broad, theory-laden categories like hysteria, the new DSM would list specific symptoms and combinations of symptoms that defined each disorder. This approach made diagnosis less subjective and less influenced by cultural assumptions about gender. When the task force working on DSM-3 sat down to revise psychiatric diagnoses in the late 1970s, they looked at hysteria and recognized it as problematic. The diagnosis was too vague, too broad, too loaded with historical baggage. It had been used to describe everything from paralysis to fainting to emotional outbursts to sexual behavior deemed inappropriate. There was no coherent symptom pattern, no clear diagnostic criteria, no evidence that it represented a single underlying condition. Most importantly, the diagnosis carried undeniable gender bias. It had been applied overwhelmingly to women, and it had been used throughout history to pathologize normal female emotional responses and control female behavior. So the task force made a decision. They would not simply reform the hysteria diagnosis, they would eliminate it entirely. The various symptoms that had been lumped under hysteria would be redistributed into more specific diagnostic categories. Unexplained physical symptoms might be classified as conversion disorder or somatization disorder. Dramatic attention-seeking behavior might be classified as histrionic personality disorder. Note that histrionic derives from the same root as hysteria, so the ghost lingered. Anxiety and depression would have their own categories. The catch-all had been broken up, and the term hysteria was gone. When DSM-3 was published in 1980, some physicians protested. They had been using the hysteria diagnosis for decades. It was familiar, comfortable, useful for describing certain patients, usually difficult female patients who presented with symptoms the doctors found frustrating or baffling. But the change stuck. Hysteria was removed from official psychiatric nomenclature. Medical schools stopped teaching it as a diagnosis. New generations of doctors were trained with different frameworks for understanding the symptoms that had once been called hysterical. But here is the fascinating question. If hysteria was removed from the diagnostic manual, did the symptoms it supposedly described disappear? The answer is complicated. Some symptoms did seem to decline in frequency. The dramatic fainting spells, the theatrical paralyses, the elaborate physical manifestations that have been so common in the Victorian era and early 20th century, these became much rarer. Why? Probably because the diagnosis itself had been reinforcing the symptoms. When doctors expected women to present with certain symptoms, when those symptoms gained attention and care, when there was a culturally recognized script for how hysteria manifested, some women consciously or unconsciously followed that script. Remove the expectation, eliminate the cultural framework, and the specific symptom patterns change. But the underlying issues, trauma, stress, anxiety, depression, the psychological impact of difficult life circumstances, those did not disappear. They simply manifested in different ways and were given different names. Women still experienced conversion disorder, where psychological distress manifested as physical symptoms. They still experienced anxiety disorders, depression, PTSD. The suffering was real. What changed was how that suffering was understood, categorized, and treated. The disappearance of hysteria teaches us something profound about the nature of illness and diagnosis. Diseases are not simply objective biological facts waiting to be discovered. They are, at least in part, social constructs, frameworks we create to make sense of symptoms, to categorize suffering, to guide treatment. The frameworks are shaped by available medical knowledge, yes, but also by cultural beliefs, power structures, and social needs. When the social context changes, diagnoses can change too, or even disappear entirely. Consider chlorosis, which we discussed earlier. It vanished in the early 20th century not because the underlying iron deficiency anemia disappeared, but because the social conditions that produced it changed, and because medical understanding advanced. Or think about drapetomania, a supposed disease of enslaved people in the American South, characterized by an overwhelming desire to run away from their enslavers. This disease was invented to pathologize enslaved people's entirely rational desire for freedom. When slavery ended, drapetomania disappeared, not because it had been cured, but because it had never been a real disease. It had been a tool of oppression. Hysteria falls into this same category. It was real in the sense that women genuinely suffered and genuinely presented with symptoms. But it was constructed in the sense that the framework used to understand those symptoms, the belief that they stemmed from uniquely female biological weakness, was shaped by cultural assumptions rather than medical reality. When those cultural assumptions were challenged and changed, the diagnosis could no longer be sustained. Does this mean we should be skeptical of all psychiatric diagnoses? Not necessarily. Some conditions, like schizophrenia or major depressive disorder, have fairly consistent symptom patterns across cultures and time periods, suggesting they reflect genuine underlying neurological or biochemical conditions. But it does mean we should remain aware that psychiatric diagnosis is not purely objective. It reflects the medical knowledge and cultural values of its time. Future generations may look back at some of our current diagnostic categories and recognize social construction at work. The legacy of hysteria lingers in subtle ways. The word itself has entered common language, almost always with negative connotations. When we call someone hysterical, we mean they are overreacting, being irrational, letting their emotions run away with them. And let us be honest, we still tend to apply this label more readily to women than to men. A man expressing strong anger is assertive or passionate. A woman expressing the same emotion risks being called hysterical. The diagnosis may be gone, but the underlying stereotype persists. medical treatment of women also continues to grapple with the legacy of hysteria. Studies show that women's pain is taken less seriously than men's, that women are more likely to have their physical symptoms attributed to psychological causes, that women face longer delays in diagnosis for many conditions. Some of this likely stems from thousands of years of medical history teaching that women are more emotional, more prone to imagining symptoms, more likely to present with psychosomatic complaints. The specific diagnosis has changed, but the skepticism toward women's reported experiences of their own bodies remains. Yet there is also progress to acknowledge. Modern medicine has, at least officially, moved away from the idea that female reproductive organs cause emotional disturbance. Psychology recognizes that trauma, stress, and difficult life circumstances can cause genuine psychological distress regardless of gender. There is growing awareness of how social factors, poverty, discrimination, violence, lack of opportunity, impact mental health. The framework has shifted from locating problems solely within individual bodies toward recognizing the complex interaction between biology, psychology, and social context. The story of hysteria's disappearance reminds us that medical knowledge is always evolving, always imperfect, always influenced by the culture in which it develops. It encourages humility in the face of current diagnostic categories and treatment approaches. What we are certain about today may be revised or rejected by future generations. It also reminds us to listen to patients, to take their sufferings seriously, to question whether our diagnostic frameworks might be shaped more by cultural bias than by objective observation. As we near the end of this long journey through the history of explaining female emotions, we have seen a remarkable story unfold. From wandering wombs to vanishing diagnoses, from demonic possession to surgical mutilation, from psychoanalytic theory to feminist critique, humanity has tried every possible explanation for female emotional life, except perhaps the simplest one. That women are human beings responding rationally to their circumstances, that their emotions are as valid and understandable as anyone else's, that the problem has never been female nature but rather the structures that constrain it. That realization, when it finally began to take hold in the latter half of the 20th century, changed everything. But the story does not end there, because we must ask, where are we now? What have we learned from this history, and what have we failed to learn? Those are the questions we turn to next, in our final reflection on 4,000 years of misunderstanding female emotions. After travelling through 4 millennia of medical history, after witnessing wandering wombs and demonic possessions and surgical mutilations and disappearing diagnoses, you might reasonably assume we have moved beyond all that now. Surely modern medicine, with its advanced technology, evidence-based practices, and heightened awareness of gender bias, treats women's emotional and physical health with the respect and understanding that was so lacking throughout history. Surely we have learned from past mistakes, and yet, if you ask women about their experiences in healthcare today, you will hear stories that echo, sometimes disturbingly, the patterns we have traced across centuries. The vocabulary has changed, the specific theories have evolved, but some of the underlying attitudes, the dismissal, the skepticism, the tendency to attribute women's symptoms to psychology rather than physiology, persist in ways both obvious and subtle. Let me share some statistics that might surprise you. A 2001 study published in the Journal of Law, Medicine and Ethics found that women who visit emergency rooms with abdominal pain wait significantly longer than men with similar symptoms before receiving pain medication, an average of 65 minutes for women compared to 49 minutes for men. A 2008 study in academic emergency medicine showed that women reporting acute pain were less likely than men to receive opioid analgesics, A comprehensive review in 2014 found that women experiencing heart attacks were less likely than men to receive appropriate cardiac interventions and faced longer delays in treatment. These are not anecdotes. These are patterns documented across thousands of patients in multiple studies. Why does this happen? Researchers point to several factors, but one keeps appearing: implicit bias. Healthcare providers, despite their training and good intentions, often unconsciously view women's pain as less serious, less urgent, more likely to be exaggerated or psychosomatic. When a man reports chest pain, the immediate assumption is cardiac emergency. When a woman reports similar symptoms, there is often a pause, a moment of questioning. Is she anxious? Is she overreacting? Could this be psychological? That pause, that moment of doubt, can have life-threatening consequences. Consider what happens with conditions that primarily or exclusively affect women. Endometriosis, a painful condition where tissue similar to the uterine lining grows outside the uterus, takes an average of 7 to 10 years to diagnose. 10 years, a decade of women telling doctors about debilitating pain, being dismissed, told it is normal period cramps, advised to take ibuprofen and relax. Polycystic ovary syndrome, affecting up to 10% of women of reproductive age, similarly faces diagnostic delays. Autoimmune diseases, which affect women at much higher rates than men, are notoriously difficult to diagnose, partially because women's symptom reports are taken less seriously. There is a term that has emerged in medical anthropology and women's health advocacy: medical gaslighting. It describes the experience of having your symptoms dismissed, minimized, or attributed to psychological causes despite having a genuine physical condition. Women describe going to doctor after doctor, being told their pain is not that bad, that they are stressed, that they should try yoga or meditation, that it is all in their head. Then, sometimes years later, they finally receive a diagnosis, often from a female physician or a specialist who actually listened, and discover they have had a real, treatable condition all along. Does this sound familiar? It should. It is the modern echo of 4,000 years of medical history telling women that their suffering stems from their nature rather than from real addressable causes. The wandering womb has been replaced by, it's probably just stress. The humoral imbalance has become, have you tried reducing anxiety? The Victorian vapours have transformed into, this might be psychosomatic. The language is more sophisticated, but the message often remains. The problem is you, not your circumstances, not a medical condition we have failed to properly investigate. Social media has given us new visibility into these patterns. Women share their stories online, and the similarities are striking. Woman after woman describes the same experience: going to a doctor with legitimate symptoms, being dismissed, persisting in seeking help, finally being diagnosed with something serious. Hashtags like medical gaslighting and believe women patients have become rallying points for a growing movement demanding better healthcare for women. But it is not just about individual experiences. The research infrastructure itself has historically been biased in ways that affect women's health. For decades, medical research was conducted primarily on male subjects, even for conditions that affect both sexes. The justification was that female hormonal cycles introduced variables that complicated research. So researchers studied men, developed treatments based on male physiology, and then applied those treatments to women. Only in 1993 did the United States mandate that women be included in federally funded clinical trials. Think about that. Until 30 years ago, medications could be approved without ever being tested on female bodies, despite the fact that men and women metabolize drugs differently, respond to treatments differently, experience different side effects. This has real consequences. Some medications that work well in men are less effective in women or cause more severe side effects. The standard dosing for many drugs was calculated based on male body weight and metabolism. Women were essentially being treated with medicine designed for male bodies and expected to make it work, when it did not work as well. When women reported unusual symptoms or poor responses to treatment, they were sometimes blamed for being difficult patients, rather than recognizing that the treatment itself might be inadequately calibrated for female physiology. Cardiovascular disease provides a example. For years, heart attack symptoms were taught based on male presentations: crushing chest pain, pain radiating down the left arm, shortness of breath. But women often experience different symptoms. They might have pain in the jaw, back, or abdomen. They might feel nauseous or extremely fatigued without classic chest pain. Because these symptoms did not match the male pattern, women's heart attacks were frequently missed or misdiagnosed as anxiety or indigestion. Even today, women are significantly more likely than men to die from their first heart attack, partially because of these diagnostic delays. Mental health treatment also carries echoes of our historical journey. While we have moved beyond diagnosing hysteria, women are still significantly more likely than men to be diagnosed with anxiety disorders and depression. Now, this may reflect genuine differences in prevalence. Hormonal factors, social stressors, higher rates of trauma exposure can all contribute to higher rates of these conditions in women. But it may also reflect diagnostic bias. When a man is angry or irritable, he is more likely to be diagnosed with a conduct disorder or anger management issue. When a woman presents with similar symptoms, she is more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety or depression. The same behaviors, filtered through gender expectations, receive different labels. Pharmaceutical treatment patterns are telling as well. Women are prescribed psychotropic medications, antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, sleep aids, at significantly higher rates than men. Again, this might reflect genuine need, but it also might reflect a tendency to treat women's distress chemically rather than investigating underlying causes or addressing social factors. If you are exhausted because you're working full-time while doing the majority of childcare and housework, is the problem a serotonin imbalance, or is it an unfair distribution of labor? If you are anxious because you're dealing with sexual harassment at work or domestic violence at home, is medication really addressing the root cause? There has been important progress we should acknowledge. More women are entering medicine and research, bringing their perspectives and experiences. There is growing awareness of gender bias in healthcare. Medical schools are beginning to teach about how implicit bias affects patient care. Researchers are studying sex differences in physiology and disease. Professional medical organizations have issued statements about the importance of believing and properly investigating women's symptoms. These are meaningful changes. Telehealth has surprisingly been a partial equalizer. Some women report that virtual medical appointments feel more equitable because the power dynamic is slightly different when doctor and patient are both in their own spaces, looking at screens. Others appreciate the easier access to second opinions and specialists without geographic limitations. The technology has created new possibilities for women to seek care in ways that might bypass some traditional barriers. There is also a growing movement toward patient advocacy and medical self-education. Women are learning to push back when dismissed, to request second opinions, to bring documentation of their symptoms, to insist on specific tests. Online communities provide support, share information about which doctors actually listen, offer advice on how to navigate a medical system that does not always serve women well. This represents women claiming agency in their own healthcare in ways that would have been impossible in earlier eras. But challenges remain, and some are getting worse. The intersection of gender with race, class, disability, and other factors creates compounded disadvantages. Black women face particularly severe disparities in healthcare. They are 3 to 4 times more likely than white women to die from pregnancy-related causes. Their pain is even more likely to be undertreated. Their symptoms are even more likely to be dismissed. The historical legacy of medical abuse and experimentation on black women and men has created deep and justified mistrust of the medical system, further complicating access to care. Transgender and non-binary individuals face their own unique challenges in a medical system built around a binary understanding of sex and gender. LGBTQ patients report higher rates of discrimination, dismissal, and inadequate care. The frameworks we have discussed throughout this history have been almost exclusively focused on cisgender women, but the underlying patterns of medical authority, diagnostic bias, and social control extend to anyone whose gender or sexuality does not conform to dominant norms. Economic factors create additional barriers. Quality healthcare requires time, resources, the ability to take off work for appointments, insurance that covers necessary tests and treatments, the freedom to seek second and third opinions if needed. Women with limited economic resources cannot navigate the system in the same way that wealthier women can. They are more likely to face dismissal and less able to persist until they find a provider who will listen. So where does this leave us? After 4,000 years of medical history, after the gradual abandonment of the most egregious theories about female nature, after the removal of hysteria from diagnostic manuals, after increased awareness of bias and inequality, we find ourselves in a strange middle ground. Things are better than they were, obviously, unquestionably better. No one is diagnosing wandering wombs or prescribing scented oils to lure organs back into place. No one is performing clitoridectomies to cure female ambition. The most blatant absurdities have been abandoned, but the deeper patterns persist. The skepticism toward women's reported experiences of their own bodies. The tendency to attribute women's physical symptoms to psychological causes. The delays in diagnosis for conditions that primarily affect women. The research gaps that leave us with less knowledge about female physiology. The implicit biases that shape treatment decisions. These are the echoes of everything we have discussed, reverberating through modern healthcare despite our best intentions. The question is not whether we have made progress. Clearly we have. The question is whether we have truly learned the lessons of this history. Have we recognized that the problem was never female nature, but rather the frameworks we created to understand and control it? Have we acknowledged that when medicine dismisses women's experiences, it perpetuates a pattern thousands of years old? Have we committed to believing women, investigating thoroughly, questioning our assumptions, and recognizing that gender bias shapes medical care whether we intend it to or not? These are not easy questions, and the answers are still unfolding. But awareness is the first step. Knowing this history, understanding how wandering wombs became toxic humours, became demonic possession, became sexual dysfunction, became nervous disorders, became hysteria, became nothing, just disappeared when the social context changed. This knowledge should make us humble about current medical certainties. It should make us skeptical when we hear echoes of the same old patterns. It should make us more determined to listen, to investigate, to believe, and to demand better. The story of how humanity has explained female emotions across 4 millennia is ultimately a story about power, knowledge, and the human tendency to create frameworks that serve existing hierarchies. But it is also, hopefully, a story about progress, about gradual recognition of past errors, about the slow, difficult work of building systems that serve everyone more justly. We have come so far from ancient Egypt and its wandering wombs, yet the journey is not complete. The final chapter in this story is still being written, and we are all part of how it will unfold. Because the question that remains, the question that ties everything together, is this: what will future generations say about our era? What explanations, what treatments, what frameworks will they look back on with the same mixture of horror and fascination that we have felt throughout this journey? And what can we do now to ensure that the answer reflects wisdom rather than repetition of old mistakes? That is the question we turn to now in our final reflection on what this extraordinary history can teach us about both our past and our future. So here we stand, at the end of a journey that has taken us from the banks of the ancient Nile to modern hospital emergency rooms, through 4,000 years of humanity trying to understand female emotions. We have witnessed theories so absurd they seem like fiction: wandering wombs seeking cool places, toxic humours controlled by the moon, demonic possession cured by exorcism, sexual deprivation turning women literally green, and organs being surgically removed to cure sadness. We have seen diagnosis after diagnosis appear, dominate medical thinking for centuries, and then vanish as though they had never existed. And through it all, one question echoes across the millennia: what will future generations think of us? Because make no mistake, we are not at the end of this story. We are simply living in the current chapter, and history suggests we should approach our own medical certainties with considerable humility. Every generation of physicians believed they had finally figured it out, finally understood what was really wrong with women. The Egyptians were certain it was the wandering womb. The Greeks knew it was humoral imbalance. Medieval doctors understood it was demonic forces. Renaissance physicians had discovered it was sexual dysfunction. Victorian doctors were convinced it was nervous weakness. Freudian psychoanalysts were sure it was penis envy and unresolved childhood conflicts. And every single one of them was wrong, or at least so incomplete in their understanding that future generations would look back in amazement at what they had missed. What are we missing right now? What frameworks are we using today that will seem as bizarre to doctors in 2124 or 2224 as wandering wombs seem to us? This is not an idle question. It is an urgent one, because women are suffering right now, today, from the gaps in our knowledge and the biases in our systems. And the lessons of history suggest we should be paying very close attention to patterns that keep repeating. Let me share something that might surprise you. In recent years, researchers have begun studying what they call the gender pain gap with renewed urgency. A 21 study published in the Journal of Pain found that when men and women presented to emergency departments with identical pain scores, women waited an average of 33 minutes longer to receive pain medication than men. 33 minutes. When you are in severe pain, that is an eternity. A 2022 review in Frontiers in Global Women's Health documented that women with chronic pain are more likely than men to be prescribed sedatives or antidepressants rather than pain medication, suggesting their pain is being treated as psychological rather than physical. Does this sound familiar? It should. It is the echo of 4,000 years of medical history, assuming women's suffering is in their heads. Or consider this. Only in the last decade have researchers begun seriously studying how the menstrual cycle affects everything from drug metabolism to immune response to brain function. For most of medical history, women's monthly hormonal fluctuations were seen as making them too complicated, too variable to study. So they were simply excluded from research. Now we are discovering that the menstrual cycle influences pain perception, inflammation, drug effectiveness, even surgical outcomes. Women have been treated with dosing schedules and protocols developed without accounting for these very real biological rhythms. How many women suffered side effects, had treatments fail, or were told their symptoms were psychosomatic because the medicine was never tested on cycling female bodies. The field of autoimmune disease provides another stark example. Autoimmune conditions, where the immune system attacks the body's own tissues, affect women at rates 3 to 4 times higher than men. Conditions like lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, and Sjögren's syndrome disproportionately strike female patients. Yet for decades, research funding for these conditions lagged far behind funding for diseases that primarily affect men. Why? Perhaps because when predominantly female patients report fatigue, pain, and systemic symptoms that are difficult to measure objectively, the old patterns kick in. Are they exaggerating? Are they stressed? Could this be psychological? The delay in diagnosis for autoimmune diseases averages 4 to 6 years, during which women visit an average of 5 doctors before receiving a correct diagnosis. 4 to 6 years of suffering, of being told nothing is wrong, of doubting your own experience of your body. But here is what gives me hope. Awareness is growing, and with awareness comes change. The last decade has seen an explosion of research into sex and gender differences in medicine. Major funding agencies now require that clinical trials include women and analyze results by sex. Medical schools are beginning to teach about gender bias in diagnosis and treatment. Patient advocacy groups, many led by women who have experienced medical dismissal, are demanding better. Social media has created communities where women can share experiences, validate each other's suffering, and collectively push for systemic change. There is also a growing recognition that the issues we have discussed are not just about gender in isolation. They intersect with race, class, sexuality, disability, and other aspects of identity in complex ways. Black women, Latina women, Indigenous women, Asian women, each group faces specific barriers and biases, shaped by the intersection of gender with racial stereotypes. LGBTQ individuals face their own unique challenges in a medical system built around heteronormative and cisnormative assumptions. Disabled women often have their symptoms attributed to their existing disabilities rather than investigated as potentially separate conditions. The conversation is expanding to recognize these complexities, and that expansion is crucial. What can we learn from this history? What wisdom can we extract from 4 millennia of mistakes? I think there are several vital lessons, and they are worth carrying forward. First, listen to women. Believe them when they report their symptoms. Take their pain seriously. Do not assume that what you cannot immediately explain must be psychological or exaggerated. Throughout history, the single most consistent error has been dismissing women's reported experiences of their own bodies. When physicians finally did listen and investigate thoroughly, they often discovered real, treatable conditions that had been overlooked for years. Listening is not just compassionate, it is good medicine. Second, question your assumptions. Every generation of physicians thought they were practicing based on objective science, but every generation was influenced by the cultural beliefs of their time. We are no different. The frameworks we use, the questions we ask, the explanations we find plausible, all are shaped by our cultural context. Maintaining humility about what we think we know, being willing to revise theories when evidence contradicts them, actively searching for our own blind spots, these are essential practices. Third, consider social context. When large numbers of women report similar symptoms before attributing it to female biology, ask what social circumstances might be contributing. Are they exhausted because of imbalanced domestic labour? Are they anxious because of real threats to their safety or well-being? Are they depressed because their lives offer limited autonomy and opportunity? Medicine cannot fix social problems, but it can at least acknowledge them rather than pathologizing natural responses to difficult circumstances. Fourth, include women in research and medicine. For too long, women were excluded from clinical trials, underrepresented in research, and absent from positions of authority in medicine. That is changing, but slowly. The more women there are doing medical research, practicing medicine, leading healthcare institutions, and shaping medical education, the less likely we are to perpetuate gender-biased frameworks. Diversity in the medical profession is not just about fairness, it leads to better healthcare for everyone. Fifth, study sex and gender differences rigorously. Men and women are not identical in their biology. Hormones matter. Physiology differs. Diseases manifest differently. Rather than treating male bodies as the default and female bodies as complicated variations, we need robust research into both. We need to understand not just that differences exist, but how they affect diagnosis, treatment, and outcomes. This is slowly happening, and it needs to accelerate. And finally, remember that diseases can be socially constructed even when suffering is real. The disappearance of hysteria, the vanishing of chlorosis, the way certain conditions rise and fall in prevalence. These teach us that diagnosis is not purely objective. It is a framework we create to make sense of symptoms, and that framework is always shaped by more than just biology. Being aware of this does not mean dismissing illness as all in the head. It means recognizing that how we categorize, understand, and treat illness is influenced by culture, power, and social needs as well as by biology. As I reflect on this extraordinary history, I find myself both disturbed and hopeful. Disturbed because the patterns are so persistent, because progress has been so slow, because women have suffered needlessly for so many centuries. But hopeful because we are living in an era of unprecedented awareness, because change is happening, because each generation does seem to learn something from the mistakes of the past, even if the learning is frustratingly slow. The story of wandering wombs and all that followed is ultimately a story about human fallibility and human progress in equal measure. It is a reminder that even our most confident beliefs might be wrong, that authority does not equal truth, that the way things have always been done is not necessarily the way they should continue. But it is also a story about gradual enlightenment, about the slow arc toward recognizing women's full humanity, about the power of questioning and revising and improving. What would I want physicians of 2024 to say about our era? I would want them to say, they started to get it right. They began to listen. They recognized their biases and worked to overcome them. They studied what had been neglected. They created more equitable systems. They learned from history and did better. Will they say that? I do not know, but I know that awareness is the first step, and sharing stories like these, painful, absurd, enlightening stories, is how awareness spreads. To every woman who has ever felt dismissed by a doctor, told her the pain was not that bad, had her symptoms attributed to stress or anxiety without proper investigation, been made to feel she was overreacting or imagining things, know that you are part of a long history. You're not crazy. You're not weak. You're not imagining it. Your experience is real, and it deserves to be taken seriously. And know that slowly, imperfectly, the medical system is learning to do better. To healthcare providers listening, I hope this history has been illuminating. I hope it has revealed patterns you might watch for in your own practice, biases you might work to overcome, assumptions you might question. The physicians who treated women poorly throughout history were not monsters. Most were trying to help with the knowledge they had. But they were constrained by the frameworks of their time. You have the opportunity to do better, to be the generation that finally breaks some of these ancient patterns. What a profound privilege and responsibility that is. And to everyone else, to all of us navigating a healthcare system that is imperfect and improving, that carries historical baggage while striving to do better, may this history make us more informed patients, better advocates for ourselves and others, and more demanding of systems that serve everyone justly. May it make us skeptical of easy explanations that blame women's nature rather than investigating real causes. May it make us allies in the ongoing work of creating healthcare that truly sees and serves women as fully human. 4,000 years, from wandering wombs to modern medicine, from scented oils to antibiotics and MRIs, from diagnoses that vanished because they were never real diseases to treatments based on rigorous evidence. We have come so far. We have so far yet to go. The journey continues, and we are all a part of writing the next chapters. Thank you for travelling through this history with me. Thank you for listening to these stories, for sitting with the absurdities and the tragedies, for thinking about what they mean for us today. I hope you found it as fascinating and enlightening as I did in researching and sharing it with you. These stories matter. They shape how we understand ourselves, our bodies, our place in the world. They remind us that progress is possible but never inevitable, that justice requires vigilance and effort, that every generation must choose whether to perpetuate old patterns or forge new paths. As you drift off to sleep tonight, let these stories settle into your mind. Let them inspire you to question, to advocate, to demand better. Let them remind you of the resilience of the countless women who endured these diagnoses and treatments, who survived despite medical systems that so often failed them. Let them give you hope that change, though slow, is real and possible. And stay tuned, because the journey through history never truly ends. There are always more stories to uncover, more lessons to learn, more connections to make between past and present. I will be back soon with more tales from the archives of human experience, more journeys through time that illuminate who we are and how we got here. Until then, sleep well, dream peacefully, and remember, you are part of this ongoing story, and your voice, your experience, your insistence on being heard and believed, it all matters. Good night.